Apparently, there was once a city in the north of Sweden called Korona, but somehow, we've all forgotten about it. I'm a police officer working in Kalix, a municipality close to where the lost city of Korona is supposed to have been. At that place, there are no signs of the city, only a dense forest. But certain details related to my own family makes me certain this place was indeed real. The entire world just forgot about it. I can't imagine how or why, but it's the only conclusion I've been able to reach. For me, this all started when 2 Romanian blueberry pickers came into my small office to report something they had found deep in the dense forest. They didn't know enough Swedish or English to explain what it was that they had found, but it was immediately clear to me that it had terrified them completely. From what I understood, it seemed to involve a human corpse. Eventually, after having brought in an interpreter from the town next to mine, it was revealed that they had stumbled upon a dead child, no more than 10 years old. They led me and 2 of my colleagues, followed by an ambulance, to the location where they had found the child. The sun was setting behind a thick mist when we got there. I lit a cigarette when we left the main road and walked into the forest, to where the child was supposed to be. I felt a bit uncomfortable having to deal with a dead child, but I had handled cases like this before, some car accidents, and didn't feel too affected by it now. It was just another job, more so I thought. The Romanians stopped when we got close and refused to go any further. There was panic in their eyes, more than I expected even given these extreme circumstances. One of my colleagues stayed with them while the rest of us continued. We soon came upon a huge boulder that had been placed there by the ice sheet that covered Europe during the Ice Age. My colleague walked around it, and a few moments later, he came running back, pale as if he had seen the devil himself. He bent down and puked right in front of me. It's on the other side. I didn't ask him any questions. I only proceeded to check it out for myself, with the medics following behind me. What we found on the other side of the boulder, it wasn't natural. Half the child, a blonde little girl, was fused with the boulder, just as if she had been passing through it as a ghost and then suddenly turned into a human before she had time to exit the rock. Or, as my colleague later remarked, it was as if she had been teleported into the rock. The girl's sorrowful, dead gaze into the forest seemed to tell a story of tragedy unknown to the living. The medics quickly shielded away from her eyes in silence, horrified by the fate she must have suffered, but I couldn't look away. I've never been a religious man, but this experience made me doubt everything I'd believed before. I don't just mean the bizarre way the poor girl had lost her life, half engulfed by the boulder. There was something else about the girl as well, something that made me feel completely empty inside, just as if a piece of my own soul was ripped out of me, leaving an empty hole in my heart that quickly filled up with a sorrow I'd never felt before. It was a dreadful feeling, only made worse by the strange fact that a small part of me recognized the girl. I couldn't tell from where. Her face was like a vague memory of a dream recently forgotten. We collected ourselves and started talking, trying to make sense of the situation without any success while the medics approached the body. I tried to focus on the hard facts while we investigated the scene. The girl was wearing a pink jacket. In one of the pockets, we found an odd-looking flower. Its colors were exotic and resembled the wings of a beetle, and a yellow library card with the text that puzzled us. The Library of Korona, it said. The girl had written her name on the card as well. When I saw it, my world started spinning. Isabella Lexelius. It said in the girl's childish handwriting. "Isn't that your last name, sir?" My colleague said. It is. I didn't know what to say or think. "Well, do you know her?" I don't know. No, I've never seen her before in my entire life. It must be a coincidence." "That's a pretty big coincidence, sir." I didn't respond to that. "There's something on the ground as well," one of the medics said. On the blood-stained moss beneath the girl, there was a notebook. It must have fallen out of her hand, the one that was hanging limply above the book. I picked it up and opened it. The pages were covered with small text, written with a different handwriting than the girl's. Sir, one of the medics said. We'll have to bring some tools to cut her down. Yes, I said absently. There's one more thing, the medic said. I put the book in a plastic evidence bag. What? There's too much blood. The medic pointed to the ground. What do you mean there's too much blood? I asked. Beneath the boulder, sir. The medic explained. It's impossible for that blood to come from a child. A moment of silence, and then I said, We'll have to come back here with better tools. A day later, we successfully removed the upper body of the girl and brought it back to the morgue where it was examined. We also tried to lift the boulder with the help of a crane, but it wouldn't budge. Instead, we dug a hole under it, but we didn't find any new body parts. All we could do this day was sample as much of the blood as possible. During the examination of the body, I read the notebook. It contained the story of the city of Korona. I was convinced it was fiction, a deranged story written by the man I thought must have killed the girl until a few weeks ago when the forensic lab called me. I still have a hard time believing it, but they told me there's no other way. They had tested the DNA of the girl and compared it to mine because of her last name. It was my idea since I didn't want anyone to suspect anything. We didn't think it would reveal anything, but it did. The 10-or-so-year-old girl, Isabella, was my daughter. I was sure it wasn't possible. 10 years earlier, I lived with my ex-wife. I never cheated on her, and certainly didn't have any children with her. We stayed together for 5 more years, so I would have known if she had had a baby during that time. And yet, there was nothing wrong with the test. Here's the transcript of the notebook. I've typed it out here in hopes that someone will remember the city of Korona or someone who might have lived in it. Please contact me if you have any information. This is what was inside the notebook. 5 years ago, I was a different person. I was younger back then, not just in the ordinary sense, but in spirit too. There was joy in my life, and I had hopes and dreams. That's all gone now. I don't have much time to write this down, but I will try and explain what happened to us, to our entire community, as well as I can. The event, as we have come to call it, occurred on July 9th, 2013. I was only visiting Korona over the day to take my niece, Isabella, to the grand opening of the Red Grove, the city's new amusement park. It was supposed to be the biggest one in Sweden, and Isabella had begged her parents to go to the grand opening, but neither of them had been able to due to work. So they called me and asked me to do it for them. I was their go-to person for when they needed help with Isabella, the only one they trusted. How I wish that hadn't been the case now, considering what happened. We arrived pretty early, a few hours before the opening, so that we wouldn't need to stay in line the whole day to get inside. The weather was amazing. It had rained earlier in the morning, so we had been a bit worried, but when we got to the city, there wasn't a cloud in sight. Isabella couldn't stop talking about how much fun we would have, and it warmed my heart to see her so happy. It took us a bit longer than expected to get to the amusement park, since one of the main streets had been closed off for a military parade. This didn't bother us that much. It rather increased the feeling of celebration in the air. To avoid the parade, we had to take a bus to the city center, the Freya Square, and from there, we had to take the subway to the yellow neutral business cluster, the tallest skyscrapers in Sweden. It was possible for us to walk to the Red Grove from there. There were people everywhere. It turned out that a lot of them had taken a ferry down the river that I didn't know about. This meant we had to stand in line after all. Isabella didn't mind, but I knew she would get hungry soon, and I worried that it would ruin her mood. Luckily, there was a man selling hot dogs from a cart that was pushing down the line. I bought a hot dog and soda for Isabella. Her parents didn't really like it when I bought her junk food, but a day like this, I thought they would understand. The man was also selling red balloons to children. Isabella said she wanted one. I tried to tell her that she would have to carry it around all day, that there would be more balloons inside the amusement park, but she wouldn't listen. Reluctantly, I bought her a balloon as well. At this point, no one knew that their entire lives were about to change in a matter of minutes. Isabella accidentally let go of the balloon. I feared it would make her sad, but it didn't seem to bother her that much. We looked at the balloon as it rose up into the air and drifted away. Soon, it was but a red dot against the vast blue sky. Then suddenly, it vanished. Where did it go? Isabella said. I couldn't explain it. It had just disappeared. I don't know, I said. Maybe it popped. But something, an uneasy feeling I couldn't rationalize, made me doubt that. Then, only a few minutes later, strong winds came from every direction. It carried a smell with it that reminded me of something rotten. Ew, Isabella said as her long hair was blowing in the wind. What's that smell? I held her hand harder. I don't know. People looked around, confused, and their joyful voices became concerned. Something was happening, but no one knew what it was. Sirens echoed in the distance, seemingly coming from the business cluster. Oh my God, a woman said and pointed towards the skyscrapers. The top of the building is gone. It wasn't that easy to see, but she was right. The top of the tallest building was gone as if it had been cut off with a knife. Isabella was too short to see it, but she picked up that something wasn't right on everyone's faces, and she became worried herself. I think we need to get out of here, I said, acting completely on instinct. I don't think it's safe. Isabella teared up. But the opening, aren't we? We'll come back later, sweetheart, I said as I walked away from the crowd with her. One of the ferries were just about to leave. We quickly stepped aboard. A few others joined us, but most of the people stayed behind in hopes that everything would be sorted out. Isabella cried, but she wasn't mad, as the ferry slowly drove away from the riverside promenade. A commotion of some kind erupted among the crowd back on land. I couldn't see what was going on, but suddenly everyone screamed in terror and tried to run towards the water. They were clearly escaping from something, but I couldn't see what it was. All I saw was people stepping on each other while they tried to jump into the river and swim away. It was a horrible sight, and I'm glad Isabella wasn't tall enough to see over the railing. Next, the sirens from the emergency alert system began blasting its eerie sound of imminent catastrophe. Everyone asked questions no one had any answers to. Most people I heard thought we were under attack, either by terrorists or the Russians. I picked up my phone to call my sister, but there was no signal. I tried with Isabella's phone as well, without any luck. I soon discovered that no one had any signal. At the sides of the river that passed through the city, people were looking out of their windows, trying to get a glimpse of what was going on. But the only thing they could see that was out of the ordinary was the cut-off building in the yellow neutral business cluster. Look, Isabella said and pointed at the sky. I've never seen such a big bird before. An enormous bird-like creature soared high above us. It was pitch black, although it was impossible to say for sure. It seemed to be just as confused about seeing us as we were seeing it. It circled the city center a few times and then flew away again. The sight of the giant bird, or whatever it truly was, turned our anxious confusion into terror. We still didn't know what had happened, but now we knew it didn't have anything to do with terrorists or some foreign power. This was something else. Something impossible to believe and yet at the same time impossible to deny. The ferry led us off a bit further down the river, close to the Fraser Square. People seemed to be in a state of panic, although no one knew what was wrong. Some were packing their cars to escape the city, others were running somewhere, perhaps to their loved ones, but most people clustered around police officers, city workers, or military personnel from the parade to try to get some information. But they only got the same answer over and over again, yelled at them so that it could be heard over the sirens from the emergency alert system, that nothing was known and they needed to return to their homes and listen to the radio for more information. How are we supposed to listen to the radio when the power's out? The voice came from an old woman. Look around, there's no power. She was right. Go home and close your windows and wait for the power to come back, a policeman said. We don't know what's going on, but the safest thing to do is to follow the procedure. He was interrupted by something happening a few meters away. The first person who had tried to leave the city, a man on a loud motorcycle, had come back. I was carrying Isabella, comforting her at the same time as I tried to hear what the man on the bike was trying to tell everyone. I pushed through to get closer to him. He walked to the center of the square and climbed up on the foot of a statue. A few people believed him, but everyone that had seen the creature in the sky had no doubt that he was telling the truth, however impossible it seemed. There's no way out, the man yelled. The main road's cut off at the edge of the city and there's only jungle. I can't explain it. I'm sorry, but it's true. We are surrounded by a dense, thick jungle, and there's no way around it. Then it's true. A policeman whispered to himself next to me. For the love of God, it was all true. I asked him what he meant. First, he didn't want to acknowledge my question, but when he saw my confusion and tears in my niece's innocent eyes, he turned to me and said quietly, "Before we lost contact with the helicopter that was surveying the parade, the pilot said something that simply didn't make sense. He was crashing. Something had cut off his rotor blades, and he said that it all had changed somehow. The view had changed. Before he hit the ground, he yelled that he had seen a jungle to the west and an ocean to the east. More and more rumors came in, and even though it was impossible to tell rumors from facts, they were all telling the same story. The entire world around the city had been replaced in an instant. The city was the same, but the sky above it wasn't. Eventually, the screaming sirens went silent. Cars stopped beeping their horns, and the cacophony of voices died out. An uncanny silence fell over the city. The feeling was beyond unreal. I didn't know what any of this meant. I tried to explain it to my niece, but she was only 5 years old. She couldn't understand. She wanted to go home to her parents, and I didn't know what to tell her. She was tired and needed rest, so I went to the hostel nearby and paid for a room. Soon, the economy of the city would collapse, but for the first few days in this new unknown world, people still accepted money as payment. What followed was 5 years of unending trials and hardships. A continuous battle for survival with no hope for help or rescue. It started during the first night. The sun, identical to our own yet new and strange, sat due north instead of west and was replaced by unrecognizable stars covering the entire sky. As I looked up at them from the small window in our room, I didn't feel awe, but rather I felt completely lost. The strange feeling during all these years must have been the paradoxical sensation of familiarity on the streets mixed with the awareness of total displacement. I think this was partly why people kept close to the city center, to drown themselves in the illusion of being home even though they knew, deep down, that they couldn't escape their fate as stranded in the unknown. Then, as I leaned out the window, I heard the sounds. People screaming, gunshots, cars driving madly through the streets without anywhere to go, and the occasional odd howling that made my blood run cold. I never saw anything of what happened that night, but it changed the population. More than 2 million people. Forever. I closed the window and hid behind the bed with Isabella. She wanted to cry for her mother, but I kept my hand over her trembling mouth. The next night was calmer, probably because no one dared venture outside. During the days, I soon realized the threat didn't come from the unknown jungle outside of the city, but from the people within it. It was impossible to tell how much crime was committed, but given what I saw with my own eyes, looting, robberies, even murders, I figured the rate of crime must have gone up by a lot. However, it wasn't total anarchy. The police and the few military units that had been in the town for the parade kept some vital order to the community. Since ordinary people didn't have guns, the police and the military weren't threatened by the average citizen. A leader stepped forward, the man on the motorcycle, and after a few weeks, everyone seemed to cooperate peacefully. The food that was left in the stores was mostly distributed fairly, and everyone that could work seemed to do it without hesitation, even I. The scientists that had been working at the university at the time of the event couldn't figure out what had happened, but with the help of hundreds of citizens, they managed to build a small nuclear power plant that could return electricity to the city. I mostly helped out with that project. I didn't know anything about nuclear physics, but I did what little I could. It was amazing what we were capable of as a people, and in all my dreadfulness, a feeling of pride grew in my chest. Although, our time in this world wasn't simple. Far from it. Aside from my personal problem with keeping Isabella healthy and safe, which I succeeded with although she never felt safe, there were 3 major problems that kept growing larger for every week. First one was the food and water situation. Some people had managed to grow wheat and potatoes in parks and soccer fields, but it wasn't enough. We were running out of food and water. It did rain from time to time, but very few people felt safe drinking the rainwater. To battle this problem and to find solutions to some other problems as well, expeditions were sent out to explore the jungle. These typically ended the same way. That is, with no one coming back. Only once or twice did someone manage to return to the city, but they weren't themselves anymore. It was as if something in the jungle had captured their souls and let their bodies walk back unscratched. The second problem was nature. It seemed to have spared us the first couple of months, but soon after we got the electricity back, it turned on us. It took a while before I saw it with my own eyes, but seemingly at random, mysterious creatures entered the city. Sometimes they just walked right through it, never to return again. A policewoman, one of the new recruits, told me that she had followed a naked blue child as it solemnly walked into the city and then back out of it again. At other times, indescribable monsters wreaked havoc on the streets, killing as many people as they could before returning to wherever they came from. At one point, and this I actually saw for myself, an enormous centipede, pure white with hundreds of red eyes, suddenly appeared from a manhole. It quickly climbed up against a building as if it knew exactly what it was doing and entered one of the windows on the top floor. Next came the screams from people inside the building. A few escaped, but everyone else inside were ripped to shreds. Only after about 5 minutes did the centipede exit the building from the entrance, its white, segmented body stained with blood, and return down the manhole. These attacks, as they were called, aroused fear and panic in all of us. Although it didn't happen that often, it happened often enough for everyone to be on edge all the time. The third problem also didn't become noticeable until later. It was the problem of health. There was no pattern to who was affected or not, but some people, probably more than 1%, got sick. It started out like a fever and slowly progressed with nightmarish mutations randomly hitting the body. Most of these mutations made the victims handicapped and disfigured, but sometimes, very rarely, the victims developed properties that were seemingly beneficial to them. The most extreme case of this that I saw was a young girl who grew a third eye in the middle of her forehead. The iris of the new eye glittered with amazing colors, and the girl claimed that she could use the eye to see other people's emotions. At the beginning of the health crisis, the sick people were treated badly, as if they had been monsters from the jungle. This treatment only got worse when it was revealed that the creatures from outside never attacked the sick. At one point, a mob gathered at Fraser Square, set on chasing the sick people out of the city. Luckily, this was stopped by the military. In the end, however, the sick people were sent into the jungle. Not to be away with them, though, but to make use of their immunity to the nature of this world. This turned into a huge success that eventually solved the food and water problem. They could venture out and explore the surrounding area and return with edible fruits, vegetables, and small mammal-like creatures that they had hunted. This was a turning point for us, and then luck struck again. All attempts at fishing had failed so far, but all of a sudden there were fish everywhere in the river. We soon learned that there were different periods for when the fish were out to sea or close to land. However, as soon as they came close to land, mysterious purple thunderstorms that lasted weeks tormented the city, and yet we survived. Many people didn't, of course, but life was possible. In the end, we prevailed. During the 5 years that followed, there weren't that many catastrophes, and our focus on survival kept most of our thoughts of home away. Even Isabella thought less and less of her parents as she grew older. Over time, most people got used to the bizarre situation they found themselves in back in July 2013. Many people did commit suicide, yes, but most people chose to live in this unknown land. 2 events, however, changed things. First, it was what happened to a planned expedition at sea. Hundreds of people, mostly men, decided to venture out into the ocean with one of the luxury cruisers that had been moored next to the city. This was going to be a great adventure and perhaps a way to find some answers to where we had ended up. It inspired all of us. Thousands of people, Isabella and I included, had gathered to watch as the huge boat slowly sailed out. It all felt similar to that day 5 years earlier when we had waited for the amusement park to open. We all stared at the horizon as the boat, named Birdo de Espero, turned into a small dot against the setting sun. We imagined the amazing adventures they would be on and looked forward to their return, but Then something that must have been larger than anything that we'd seen so far came out of the water and swallowed the ship whole. Some people screamed and others cried. This was a hard blow to the city, just knowing a being like that, a being able to eat an entire luxury cruiser in one bite, could exist, deprived many people of their hopes of a future. The next event was different. It was a miracle, to say the least. It happened only a month after the destruction of Berto de Espero, a military guard. A young man who had been only 15 at the time of our disappearance from Earth discovered that when we stood at a certain place at Fraser Square, he could tune into a specific radio station from our old world. The station's name was Synthwave Mix and dedicated most of its broadcasting to that kind of music. Hope returned immediately, but this time the hope was different from the one we had spent 5 years building up within ourselves. This was the hope of seeing our loved ones again, the hope of returning home. The people at the university investigated the area to try to determine where the radio signals were coming from. They didn't have much success, but soon realized that they emanated from the ground beneath Fraser Square. While the area was investigated by scientists, ordinary people showed up en masse. They all had radios of different kinds with them, like children carrying stuffed animals to feel safe, hoping to tune into this synthwave mix and to get a taste of their lost home. Of course, the area where the radio station could be heard was too small, and police had to chase away everyone to give the scientists the room they needed. A few days later, though, the scientists placed a set of large speakers at the foot of the statue of Fraser and connected them to the receiver they were using to listen in on the radio station. Day and night, the relaxed, somewhat melancholic, synthetic music played non-stop to the entire city. People congregated around the statue. They even defied the dangers of night. This became our city's new tradition, ending the day by going to the statue and sitting down around it as if in prayer became our pilgrimage. It wasn't exactly the music that drew people to the square, but rather its origin. Still, the electronic melodies soon turned into a symbol of all of our hopes and desires. From time to time, people got up and danced, sometimes while crying from a bittersweet joy difficult to explain. Although, the thing that made us all go silent and become totally focused was when the host said something. Usually, they only spoke about the music they were broadcasting, completely unaware that an entire city full of people were listening to them almost religiously. But on rare occasions, they talked about the world outside. At those times, it felt like our hearts collectively stopped in anticipation. Would they say something about us? About their efforts to figure out where we had all gone and how they would bring us back? But there was never any news about us, just as if they'd already forgotten about us or never known about us at all. The tragic fate of the city of Korona never came up, yet we never lost faith. It took a long time, and now I'm getting closer to the present day, but eventually, the scientists decided that it would be worthwhile digging a large hole right where the radio waves seemed to sip out of the ground. This was no easy task, and neither was it safe, but the work took weeks. Again, we all helped. No one really knew what exactly we were looking for. We only knew that it was something. When we reached the bottom, where the rock was too hard to dig through, a mountain of dirt covered the entire square. Our efforts hadn't been in vain. We discovered, right beneath the place where the radio waves had been picked up, there was a small hole in the bedrock. People were asked to back away from it while the scientists investigated it. First, they tried to measure how deep it was. This took some time since it was hard to find a long enough rope. In the end, it was estimated to be about 700 meters deep. Next, some equipment was sent down, tied to the end of the rope. Everything that was sent down was swallowed up by the hole. Of course, no one knew where it went, but we all thought the same thing, that somehow it had returned home. It was a reasonable assumption, given that the only thing coming out of the hole, the radio waves, came from Earth. We all rejoiced in this discovery. More experiments were done, and although some questions remained unanswered, the consensus, even among the scientists, was that the hole really was a portal back to our own world. There were two large problems that needed to be solved, though. The first was the safety. Every time something tied to the rope disappeared at the bottom of the hole, the rope was cut off, just like the skyscraper 5 years earlier. This meant that it was possible that whoever entered the hole would be cut off as well. However, this problem was solved pretty soon by tying a camera to the rope connected to a screen above ground. It was discovered that the rope was only cut off when pulled back. As long as it wasn't pulled back, the screen still received signals from the camera. The camera never recorded anything other than darkness on what was assumed to be the other side, but since it continued to work until the rope was pulled back, it didn't seem to be such a big problem. After all, some technical issues were expected under the circumstances. The second problem was that the hole was too small for anyone to fit into. Many attempts were made to widen the hole, but the bedrock seemed to be made out of stronger material than any of our machines could tear into. This was extremely frustrating. It made us feel like we had reached the finish line only to discover that we were unable to cross it. In the end, one of the scientists said she wanted to send her 10-year-old son down the hole. He was small enough to fit into it. This was widely debated for some time before it was approved. The mother argued that the city of Korona was no place for her son, and that all evidence suggested the hole was the only way home. The boy was brave. He knew he would probably never see his poor mother again, but still went through it. He was given a walkie-talkie, and after a tear-filled goodbye to his mother, he was sent down the 700 meters deep, pitch-black hole. He was instructed to radio in after he reached the other side, confirming he was safe. After the rope was pulled back, the mother waited and waited for her son to report. However, he never did. For weeks, the mother sat at the edge of the hole, under merciless heat and under pouring rain, calling her son over and over again with her walkie-talkie. No one knew what, if anything, had gone wrong, since no other radio waves had been picked up other than the synthwave mix. It was possible that other radio waves simply couldn't enter into our world for some reason. Still, the authority deemed the hole too unsafe for anyone else to enter. This didn't change people's minds, though. The hole represented the only true hope we had felt in years, and given all of the terrible things in our world that could destroy us at any moment, as easily as it is for us to blow out a candle, the small risk of going through the hole seemed to be more than acceptable. The hole was guarded by the police, but most of the police shared the city's collective opinion that the hole was the only way out. Not for any of the adults, but for our children. And now I'm sitting here, in the room I paid for 5 years ago, writing this down. During the last few weeks, many parents have been sending their children down the hole at night. This world is truly no place for them. Although they could survive, they deserve better. Hence, like many others, I've decided to send Isabella home. When I told her about it, she looked at me with happiness in her eyes I hadn't seen since we were transported to this dreadful, God-forsaken world. I've been writing this all day now. It's a testimony to what happened to Korona. I will give this notebook to Isabella. I'm sure that she will be able to give it to her father. Somehow, I know it in my heart that she will find her way home to her parents. Soon it will be dark, and I will bring Isabella to Fraser Square one last time. I'm sorry it took so long.
Subject 23, Project Entryway, derivative of the Montauk Project, and an absolute horror show. My name is Joshua A. Jameson, and I was part of the United States Air Force from 1978 to 1998. I spent the first third of my service as a pararescueman, and that much I'm proud of. The other 2/3 is eating me away inside. Now, for starters, I'm going to let you know that I'm going to avoid flair and filler. I will, however, provide you with what little evidence I've retained over the years. Skip over it if you want, the truth remains the same. I've noticed that the infamous Montauk Project has gotten a little more notoriety over the past few years, and most of us have heard the story by now. Military scientists kidnap children and expose them to torture, all to try to unlock innate abilities. Most notably, the ability to conjure something out of nothing. The sister project of Montauk, Project Entryway, has stayed silent even over the growing years. I won't let that stand any longer. Us at Project Entryway followed a similar direction as Montauk, with the only major difference being that we weren't trying to make something new. We were trying to find something already here. While the geeks over at Montauk tried to conjure up vases and monsters using their minds, we were trying to explore the unexplored. I can't tell you how the scientists got involved, mostly just folks from Brookhaven Laboratory, I'd guess. But I joined when I heard about a long-term joint forces mission needing volunteers to form medical and security details. Well, as a pararescueman, I had both, so I applied to the job's posting and submitted my resume and hoped for the best. I got the job. Soon enough, I was being flown down to New York with 3 other security guys, being ushered down to Camp Hero. At this time, no one really knew about Montauk. The internet was in its baby phase, and fear from the Cold War left the information, what was available, double encrypted and ciphered. As far as we were aware, Camp Hero was just another radio site. After our landing and a bit of a drive, we hit Montauk Point, New York. We passed through the small, friendly-looking town and through some forest before reaching a small, gated military outpost. The only thing of note was a large radio tower, which we all expected from our research. Our driver pulled up to the security checkpoint, and all of our gear was confiscated. I'd assumed they'd search it and give it back to us, but instead, they just threw it in some vault, and I never saw any of it again. To make up for our stolen gear, they gave us brand new uniforms, along with whatever else we needed. Me and the rest of the security boys weren't used to this kind of treatment. It was just too clinical for the usually sarcastic and snide security police members we were used to. Our whole conversation consisted of this. They'd ask a question, we'd answer. They'd ask if we needed anything, we'd say no, and then silence. I'm not sure if the boys we interacted with knew what was going on inside of the facility, but they sure as hell didn't try to make friends with us. Given enough time, we were geared up and ready to go. The captain in charge of in-processing told us our debrief would be first thing that following morning, and for us to try and get some rest if we could. That's when a few uniformed men escorted us across the field and into the radio tower. When we entered the facility, we walked right to the communications center, staffed by only a handful of men, and down a tight hallway. We found ourselves facing a large concrete door. A few guards nearby pushed it open, exposing a flight of stairs leading straight downwards. Wherever we were going had to be in the bowels of the earth. The stairs seemed to continuously descend. Our walk down took whatever courage we had. There was a certain electricity in the air that was unnatural. It didn't feel like you were being watched. It felt like you were alone. I think we all took a deep breath of stale air when we hit the bottom of that staircase. What lay in front of us now was a hub of hallways and doorways. People in lab coats were walking around, conversing and eyeing us. We were guided over to our living quarters, separate from Montauk security members, of course, and we were once again instructed to get some rest. Now, one thing you should know about military members, no matter what branch, we're all just kids. We talk, we gossip, we're inappropriate, and when you leave us to ourselves, we do the opposite of what you want. We were told to sleep, therefore, we were told to chat each other up like giddy schoolchildren. It was then that I got to know everyone. There was Bobby Wilkerson, former speech champion from Washington State. Then was Gregory Caparelli, all-star college baseball player from Jersey. And of course, Tanaka Yoshida, a child of Japanese soldiers during World War II and the biggest American patriot I knew. Why did I tell you their names? Well, because they deserve to be remembered. They were good people who just wanted to do the best they could out in the world. Each had dreams. They all wanted to be something when they left the service. Bobby wanted to be a congressman. Georgie wanted to work for his father at their lumber mill, and Yoshida just wanted to retire as a United States serviceman with full honors. That's it. That's all they wanted. After our brief yet giddy exchange of words, we managed to get what little sleep we could. One thing I remember about sleeping down there, once the lights went out, that place was darker than dark. We were God knows how many feet underground, and there was absolutely zero natural light. Once the man-made lights were out, all lights were out. After an undetermined amount of time, morning must have hit. We were all awoken by a scraggly-looking and frail scientist. He introduced himself as Dr. Grant Hargrove and asked us to follow him to the experiment area. We walked down the maze-like corridors, passing all sorts of men from all different backgrounds. Some seemed disheveled, while others seemed to stare off into space. Besides a few whispers between each other, this facility was dead quiet around us. After a couple of minutes of walking, we reached our destination, a big metal door with black paint reading Sub-Project 23 in blocky letters. Dr. Hargrove turned towards us and began his speech.
Inside these doors is where you'll spend most of your time. We don't have much funding, so the four of you will have to do for security. You can work the details of that on your own as long as we have 2 armed members inside of this room at any given time while our experiment is running. You are to take the title of Squadron 08-23.
At these words, we glanced at each other. 4 members certainly didn't make a squadron. At our glances, we heard Hargrove make a grunt before continuing.
Yes, I'm well aware there are only 4 of you. It's just to provide leeway in case members need to be exchanged or replaced in a timely manner. If you have any questions, you may only ask them to me or one of the other scientists involved in Sub-Project 23. You won't speak a word about what we're doing to anyone, including the other workers down there. Understood?
His tone was matter-of-fact and rehearsed. Who knows how many times he's told this briefing, and who knows what happened to the others that were working down here before us. I had always hoped we were the first, but something tells me we weren't. He turned his back to us and typed in some numbers into a small keyboard next to the door. We heard several clicks as the locks disengaged. Hargrove opened up the door for us, and we stepped inside. The room was a massive concrete rectangle. The ceilings had to have been as tall as a small auditorium. The only structures inside this facility were right next to us, a set of steps leading up to an observation post. A door, similar to the one we just entered from, stood at the top of the step. The steps themselves seemed to be nothing more than a glorified rolling stepladder. There were indents in the concrete floor, allowing the stairs to be pushed away from the observation door. Strange, I remember thinking to myself. We're dozens of feet underground in a highly fortified facility. What good could these extra safety measures be in place for?
Each of these doors are installed with 7 magnetic locks, 4 divided on the top and bottom and 3 on the side. They can withstand about 1,500 pounds of force each and can only be disabled with the code of the day. The codes will change daily, so make sure you check the logs in the observation room up those stairs.
He lifted his frail-looking arms toward the observation deck.
Sir, what will be our daily duties?
I heard Bobby's soft voice ask. The doctor tried to give a warm smile towards Bobby, but it seemed pained and forced.
Hopefully, all you'll have to do is sit down in front of some machinery and let us scientists do our work. If something should happen to us, you may have to provide security or search and rescue operations.
We all looked at each other, then back to the nearly empty warehouse. The only thing standing out in the barren room was some metallic pillars and beams aligned to the opposite side of the room from the observation deck. Wires ran from the pillars straight into the concrete of the nearby walls.
Search and rescue? As in here? In this room?
Georgie's loud Italian voice echoed in the concrete shell we found ourselves in. Dr. Hargrove's gaze turned behind us, his eyes defocusing and forming into thought.
In a way.
He muttered quietly, more to himself than us. Before he could clarify, the door to the observation room clicked open, giving a loud groan as the metal fought against the arms of whoever was pushing.
Jesus, I get these doors, but really?
A voice rattled off from behind the door as it opened, eventually revealing a man of good stature. He looked like one of us, a serviceman rather than a scientist, though his lab coat expressed something different.
Hey everyone, sorry for interrupting. My name's Dr. Carter, and I'm the exploratory scientist of this project.
He gave a charming smile before nodding towards Hargrove.
I overheard Dr. Hargrove mentioning saving one of us. That will most likely mean me. In case something happens, I just want to say I'm appreciative of you guys. I know you're in the dark right now, but we're going to be doing some exciting things down here.
Dr. Carter flashed another smile, exposing his pearly white teeth. Dr. Carter was clearly more of a people person than Dr. Hargrove. Just behind him stood half a dozen other scientists writing things on clipboards, pulling levers and activating switches. It was such a large room, yet the only space that seemed to be in use was the observation room. I could feel my hair stand up as a feeling of apprehension came over me. Something was off here. I was just a normal kid for the time we were in. I never much watched science fiction movies or shows. I never believed in the boogeyman, and I believed wireless phones were the work of the devil. What I was seeing made me double think all of that. Well, except maybe for the devil part.
So, Dr. Hargrove, if you wouldn't mind stepping up here and taking control, I'm going to introduce these guys to Project Entryway.
Dr. Carter eagerly headed down the metal stairs, skipping a few steps here and there.
Oh, you guys are going to love this.
He waved his arms at us, beckoning for us to follow. Dr. Carter took us nearly all the way to the other side of the facility before stopping and turning around. I saw his eyes meet Hargrove's in the operations center. Carter lifted his hand and gave a thumbs up to Hargrove.
You guys might want to close your eyes and open them when I tell you to. Most people faint after seeing this their first time. Brains can't process it much, but exposure helps.
I saw Georgie cover his eyes with his hands and turn around, heeding the doctor's advice.
Oh, forget this,
Georgie muttered under his breath while shaking his head. Bobby, Yoshi, and myself all decided to keep our eyes on the empty concrete wall in front of us. Within just a few moments, we heard the whirling mechanical sounds of machinery coming to life from the metallic pillars jutting out of the floor. Before we knew it, something appeared in front of us, or rather, stopped appearing. The back wall completely disappeared into a thick and syrupy black shadow. It seemed to give out a pulse that made our bodies react in the worst way. It felt like whatever this thing, this shadow was, had the power to radiate the symptoms of vertigo. Each pulse sent a wave through our brains that told us to look away. I saw Yoshi and Bobby both fall to their knees beside me. Bobby had buried his head into his lap and covered his ears, trying to stop the pulsing from getting into his mind. Based on how he was acting, I don't think it helped.
This wall is now a door, gentlemen. A gateway to another plane of existence. If you haven't already viewed it, then please look.
Georgie uncovered his face and turned around. Immediately, his face turned a pale and sickly color.
We've ran test after test to get this right. We brought you in because we're finally ready to send a person through. That'd be me.
Dr. Carter stood in front of us with a wide grin on his childish face. His back was towards the pulsating black void behind him. I couldn't help it anymore. I threw up. We all exited our meeting that day without a word between us. We received our mission statements and were told the testing would begin next afternoon after a morning of calibrations. We had off until then. It wasn't until we entered the mess hall that one of us spoke up.
What the fuck did we sign up for?
Georgie mumbled angrily to his food.
I don't know, man, but just stay positive. Maybe it's not as strange as we think it is.
Bobby replied, trying to reassure our little group.
Not as strange. A fucking wall disappeared. Fucking gone. And what took its place? A goddamned...
Yoshi cut him off as his voice was starting to rise in anger.
Remember what they said. No talking about it unless we're in that room.
Georgie listened to Yoshi and quieted himself down, shaking his head in disbelief. I had nothing to add to the topic. I still felt sick and my head wouldn't stop pounding. I dreaded the morning. Sadly, as much as you dread something, it doesn't stop it from coming. We were woken up a little later than usual as the science crew did their calculating. It didn't help much. I think we were all still shaken up about what we saw the day prior. In light of that, we all agreed that each of us would sit in to see what was going to happen that morning. We grabbed our weapons from the armory and headed to the project room. Once inside, we saw nearly 3 times the previous staff walking back and forth. They must have had the whole project's science division prepared for what was about to happen. We took some seats near the observation room staircase and watched the men work from afar. Amidst all the lab coats running back and forth, we saw a man who looked like he came straight from the moon. He had heavily padded and sealed-off clothing with a wide visor. There was no other way to describe him. He looked like an astronaut. The rest of the crew did function tests on his gear, checking the pressure levels and making sure he could see properly through the visor. A few lab techs dragged out a large piece of machinery with a large bundle of wires and tubes attached. They hooked up a large tube to the man using a fist-size opening at the small of his back. At this point, I could safely assume that the individual inside the suit was Dr. Carter. I didn't envy him for what he was about to do. I did, however, notice the 4 other suits similar to his stacked up on some crates near the far side of the wall. I knew those would be ours if something happened to the doctor. All the prep work took upwards of an hour. They were trying to make everything as suitable as possible for what they were trying to do. Soon enough, the scientists backed away from Dr. Carter and joined us on the opposite side of the room. Their expressions ranged from giddy to frightened. I don't know what tests they ran before this, but no one seemed to know what to expect. I heard an exchange between the scientists while we were waiting for the next step.
It's a 10-minute trial, right? No exploration today, just making sure the device works.
I saw the other gentleman nod his head. The room fell silent as Dr. Carter turned around and faced the operation room. He gave the thumbs-up signal and turned to face the far wall. Everyone watched intently as the machines whirred to life, casting away the matter that made up the wall and exposing the void underneath. Over the intercoms in the room, we heard Dr. Carter's voice.
Testing! Testing! Can you hear me?
That's affirmed, Dr. Carter. We are good to go with the test run.
Dr. Hargrove's emotionless voice rang out over the loudspeakers. He walked towards the void until his face was inches from it.
Should I say something important or memorable?
Carter's voice jokingly said over the speakers. You could hear the fear he was trying so hard to cover up.
It'll be okay, Carter. We have security standing by.
Hargrove's voice responded. I felt my body tense up, realizing that he was referring to us.
Well, how about our mission motto then? Dominant quad non-intelligent. Hopefully saying that is true and we have nothing to fear.
He gave a slight chuckle to himself before quickly stepping into the void. The instant he disappeared from our view, the loudspeakers exploded with sound. High-pitched screeching poured over us, sending some lab technicians to the ground, covering their ears. My team and I stood up in reflex, aiming our rifles down the portal. Just then, the sound abruptly stopped, and a figure emerged from the inky blackness. The thing was big, with a single large eye reflecting the room like a predator in the night. I could feel the tip of my finger tighten around the trigger before I realized what it was. It was Dr. Carter. Less than 1 second after stepping through the portal, he emerged back. Hold! One friendly stepping out! I called out to my team, each lowering their rifles at my words.
Oh, thank God! I thought something happened to all of you.
Carter called over the intercoms.
I talked for 10 minutes straight and got no response.
The technicians all ran to help Dr. Carter take off his suit and take vitals. There was an odd red powder all over his uniform. They tossed each article of gear he had into hefty plastic bags and tossed them aside. His brow was drenched with sweat, and he was breathing heavily.
We need lighter suits,
he said while gasping for air. I looked up to the observation deck and saw Dr. Hargrove and his team quickly going over notes and handling some machinery. Soon, Dr. Hargrove reached for his microphone.
Carter, all your transmissions came back within a second. All 10 minutes of it. Were you really on the other side for the full time?
Dr. Carter reached for a microphone off one of the techs and spoke.
Sure as hell was. It's different over there. I counted my time and came back when I hit 10 minutes in. I guess we didn't factor in possible time discrepancies. It's going to make things harder for communications.
Hargrove and his team upstairs talked for a few minutes before returning to the microphone.
Communications are going to have to be one way then. We'll be able to slow down your voice, but you can't speed ours up before it gets to you. Next test we'll try the one-way system. But give us a report on what you saw.
Carter arched his back, trying to crack his fatigued bones while doctors took his blood.
We definitely found a new place. I didn't explore very far, but I did note that I saw what looked like a city skyline not too far ahead. Maybe an hour's walk or two. The gear had the same weight as well, so no distribution of gravity.
As Carter was recalling what he experienced, Dr. Hargrove rapidly took notes.
Also, I heard, I don't know how else to phrase it, moans? Off near the cityscape. Hundreds of beings, maybe. I couldn't tell if they were in pain or not, but it definitely was some sort of moaning or screaming. I can't be sure, but I think I might have also seen some things walking around.
Explain.
Well, they were far at first, human-shaped. Maybe a little taller than a person? They seemed to see me, but I couldn't make out any features on them. They were far away across the sands and all I could see was blackness. They looked like they were made of the same material as the gateway. They were getting closer the longer I was there. Had to have been a few at the start, but by the time I came back through, it was closer to 12. They didn't seem to walk, just kind of, I don't know, got closer? Glided, maybe.
Did you feel threatened by them?
No, at first it seemed like they were just observing. I'm not sure if they wanted to make contact with me or what, but they didn't feel right. They aren't like you or me. They just are. Like I said, I couldn't see them that well, so maybe I'm overthinking it, but they seemed like standing shadows that had some sort of mass to them.
Carter's voice finally trailed off. Even from our distance, I could see he was shivering.
Understood. Debrief with me in private. We're shutting down the gate for today, everyone. Dismissed.
My team headed back to our room. We were all a little uneasy by what the doctor had described. Given enough time, our unease became the norm. The next few tests were more trial runs. Much of the same happened. Dark figures in the distance, moans from the city, and audio issues. Eventually, they worked the last part out, though. They slowed down the recordings in real time so we could hear everything that Dr. Carter says. Though it's odd to say the least to watch him step back through the gate with his voice still echoing over the loudspeakers, like he was still out there. With the audio fixed, Phase 2 started. Exploration. We were woken up that morning with the knowledge that something new was going to happen. What that entailed, none of us knew. The day was starting a little earlier than most. My team and I were told to be ready by mid-afternoon. Up until then, we could sleep in or get some food. We spent that free time choking down some food and pondering in silence. Today was the big day, Exploration Day. The test was scheduled to be the longest by far, totaling an astonishing 36 seconds on our side and 6 hours on Carter's. That allowed him to travel 2 hours to the city, 2 hours to account for exploration and possible fatigue he might have, and the final 2 hours to make it back home safely. It definitely was going to be a rough day for Dr. Carter, regardless of the outcome. Luckily, it looked like he was more than ready. When he entered the facility that afternoon, we were greeted by a now familiar sight. Lab coats of doctors and technicians blowing about as the people wearing them rushed from place to place. Having nothing to offer at this point, we took our seats near the observation deck and listened to the conversations of the eggheads in front of us. That's when I overheard something that still haunts me. Up until now, I thought of the gateway as being a portal to another world, somewhere far away. I had imagined that the things Dr. Carter had encountered were billions of light years away. I guess I was wrong.
Is there any way something over there could get to us?
A lab tech asked one of the scientists jotting down notes.
I don't think so, but I could be wrong. The whole place inhabits the same space we do. It's just blocked off from us. Theoretically, if we can interact with them, that means they can interact with us. Or perhaps we're on a higher plane of existence, in which case we can affect them, but they can't affect us. And what if neither of us are natives of that place? You said yourself that this dimension of space was the easiest to program into. What if something else programmed into it as well?
The scientist put down his pencil and gave a half-hearted chuckle.
Well, then the odds that we're from the higher plane of existence drastically falls apart.
I thought about what that meant. I still do. Everything Dr. Carter saw while on the other side was somehow around us, occupying the same space. When he stepped through the portal, he was still technically here, just also not. Something about that, about the fact that it was right here, right next to us, scared the shit out of me.
Dr. Carter, are you ready?
Dr. Hargrove's voice echoed out around us. The mass of lab coats filling the center of the room dispersed, leaving only Carter and his suit visible.
Hey, you know me, Hargrove.
Can I get that in a yes or no statement, please?
Hargrove gave a wink and a smirk as he stood in the observation room, clipboard in hand.
For you, anything.
A few scientists gave a slight chuckle at Carter's difficult nature. The doctor then patted down his suit, looking for any flaws.
Everything seems good on my end. Pressure's still golden and audio seems to be operational. Want to get the timer down here?
I looked up at Hargrove as he said something to one of his assistants. The young tech then ran out of the door carrying a rather large tripod with a thick television-sized screen on top of it. The assistant brought the device midway between the observation deck and the metallic pillars. He grabbed a cord and plugged the machine into one of the nearby walls. As soon as it had power, it showed the numbers 36. 36 seconds. For 36 seconds, Carter would be gone. For those seconds, he'd make a 6-hour journey into a city we couldn't see and make it all the way back home safely.
Well, are we good to go?
Carter asked while looking up at the observation deck. Hargrove nodded in response and began to flip some nearby switches. The familiar buzz coming out of the pillars resonated inside the concrete box. We watched as the wall fell away into the familiar void once more.
Wish me luck, boys.
He turned around to face the gateway before glancing back at us.
Please get me back if something happens. I'm counting on you guys.
We nodded in response. Our faces didn't show it, but I can vouch for all of us when I say our hearts were pounding against our chests.
36 seconds.
He muttered and gulped down as he stepped through the portal. Hargrove's assistant hit the button on the counter and the half-a-minute wait started.
I hope you guys can hear me. By this time, it's probably been a fraction of a second for you, but I've begun my walk towards the city.
27 seconds.
The Shadow Men are still here. Still far away. But they're facing me.
19 seconds.
I can already tell we need to work on these suits. Jesus, is this going to be a long walk?
12 seconds.
Should be pretty close to the time I get back, huh? Lucky future me.
4 seconds. At this point, you could see sweat pouring down our foreheads. 4 seconds meant 40 minutes for Carter, plenty of time for him to make it back, but seeing the single-digit countdown from the timer brought a sense of paranoia with it. A loud resonating beep came over the loudspeakers as the clock hit 0. As a precaution, this meant we were to gear up immediately in case of emergency. My team quickly got up out of our seats and rushed over to the supply area. Lab techs were already standing by with our suits ready to go. As soon as we made it to the gear, a slight sucking noise came from the portal. All of us turned our heads and faced the gateway. Standing dead center in the void was all the gear that made up Carter. He slowly crept forward, his feet dragging slightly under the weight of his suit. He looked like he was in pain. "Go, quickly! Take off his gear and give him some air!" I called out to the techs standing near our equipment. They looked at me, shocked. They weren't used to being bossed around by the security. Luckily, they noted the urgency in my tone and ran over to help. Carter fell down hard on the concrete floor. A loud, muffled slam came from underneath him. Both the doctors and their assistants quickly rushed over. Me and the rest of the guys traded glances. I had some medical experience, but nothing like the doctors around us. I heard them undoing the straps around his face mask before ripping it off. From my position, all I could see was several men falling over backwards with horrified looks on their faces. I quickly ran over to see what was happening, only to discover an empty faceplate. As they took off more and more of Carter's gear, they discovered less and less. Carter wasn't inside. Nothing was. "Gear up!" I called out to my crew. Dr. Carter was missing, and it was our job to find him. Our supply guys rushed back and began to help us put on our gear. It took around 10 minutes to get completely outfitted. That meant Dr. Carter was already missing on his end for close to 4 days. His voice, however, was still ringing out over the intercom, talking about nothing more than his walk towards the city. I felt like a ghost was talking to us. Hargrove's voice came over the loudspeaker with a venomous tone.
Your primary objective at this point is to find Dr. Carter's visual recordings. Secondary priority is to find his person. Do you understand? As soon as you find his recordings, you bring it back.
Visual recordings. I remember mumbling to myself. Then it hit me. After every debrief, Carter would have a private meeting with Hargrove. These meetings must have been a showcase on the visual recordings Carter obtained. They had us in our uniforms instead of prepped and ready in the suits. The longer it took us to gear up left a larger chance that whatever got Carter had moved on, leaving the evidence behind. Dr. Carter had to have known our main priority wouldn't be to save him. That's why he asked us personally to search for him and bring him back. Hargrove only cared about his pet project, not about anyone involved. It was at this point I could feel my hands clench up into fists, watching each of their reflective helmets do the same. It was time to begin our true mission. We each approached the gateway. It looked different up close, and it was hard to focus your eyes on it. Every millimeter of the dark matter seemed to explode outward, then contract back in. The void was in a constant and eternal motion. When we approached the gate, the tar it was made of seemed to reach out just a little bit further, as if it was trying to reach out and pull us inside of it. I bit back my urge to try and run from this godforsaken mission, and so did my team. Without another word, we stepped inside. Dr. Carter never revealed the feeling you get when you step inside the gateway. My body felt like it was transforming, like a horrible growth pain. I felt my skin being pulled and tugged while simultaneously being pushed away from my body. The feeling only lasted for a few seconds before we all appeared on the other side of the gateway. In front of us stood the reddened flatland that we had imagined during the last few weeks. It was exactly like we pictured. Flat land covered in red sand that the wind would kick up every few seconds. I glanced around and saw the massive portal behind us. It looked the same on this end that it did on the other, a pulsating, incomprehensible mess.
Hey, you hear that?
Georgie called out to us. I listened closely and heard what he was talking about. Moans and bellows coming from a very long ways away.
That must have been the sound Dr. Carter was talking about. It doesn't sound right.
Bobby chimed in. He was right. It didn't sound like someone with a broken bone or fracture, nor did it sound like a melancholy drawl. It sounded very much alive and visceral.
Well, I guess we should head towards it, huh? I think I can see the skyline coming from that direction.
I peered through the sand gusts and looked closely. Very vaguely, I could see what looked like massive towers jutting out of the ground, spiraling up towards the reddening sky. They looked unfinished. The shadows of scaffolding could barely be seen looming over the tops of their unfinished roofs. I looked around once more and saw nothing else. I didn't like that one bit. Every single time Carter went through, he described the shadow men watching him, yet we were all out here alone.
Let's move.
Yoshi instructed, and I nodded in agreement.
The sooner we head towards the city, the sooner we can get back home.
So our walk began. I'd like to say we saw things out there, other buildings, people, creatures, but the fact is, we saw nothing other than that ever-growing city in front of us. The towers we once squinted to see grew clear, as did the buildings below them. We were about 10 minutes outside the city before our feet hit pavement. There was a long road hiding underneath the red dust of the land that reached straight into the city. When a strong gust of wind took hold, the dust would shift, exposing vehicle light reflectors and white lines. I felt a chill ran up my spine as I thought back to what the scientists said. We were still on Earth. We just weren't in our usual spot. I pushed those feelings aside and pressed forward. As we neared the first building on our walk, I noticed the material it was made of. Glass, stone, brick, everything we'd used back home, yet I saw nothing on our whole walk that could constitute where they got these materials from. I reached out to feel the building under my gloved hand, and a voice startled me back to reality.
Holy shit!
Georgie called out. Our heads followed his gaze. Ahead of us, a few dozen meters down the road, was one of the shadow men Carter had mentioned. Whatever this thing was, it didn't seem to belong here. The being's body had begun to pulsate and shake furiously. It seemed like it was made from a less stable version of our gateway. Eventually, it stretched itself out thin, quickly becoming more translucent before vanishing before our eyes.
What was that? I don't like this.
Bobby whispered softly, his voice creaking under his anxiety.
Where do we even begin to look?
Yoshi asked directly to me, obviously trying to maintain mission focus.
Well, if I was stuck outside that portal all day and could only see the skyline of this place, I'd try to go to the biggest tower I saw.
The others glanced forward. A few miles ahead was the largest skyscraper in the city.
Let's head out then.
Bobby said as he gripped the rifle in his hands tighter. We walked down the barren streets, surrounded by nothing but screaming. It was clear they were coming from inside each building, but curiosity or not, I would never be willing to lead my men into unnecessary danger just to explore.
One cut is all it takes.
A voice whispered.
Did you guys say something?
I asked out. I knew I had heard something under all the howling voices around us. My team all shook their heads and pressed on.
Can you see us?
Hey, stop walking. I know I heard something.
I barked out as I began to look around.
Are you dreaming yet?
That time I heard it straight in my ear. Not on the outside of my suit, but in there, with me. I could almost feel their breath wrapping around my face. I pulled my rifle up and aimed it towards the voice. I saw my team raise their weapons up with me. I don't know if they heard what I did, but they stood by me.
Jameson, by your feet!
Bobby said as he quickly dropped to a knee and began surveying the area. I looked down and froze. On the red sands below me lay footprints, long, talon-like claws. They had been following us since we entered the city, and none of us had noticed. What made things worse is they were facing towards me, circling my body every step of the way. I felt my body begin to grow weak. I heard a shot ring out from Georgie. I looked over and saw the barrel of his rifle aiming towards the glass window nearby.
There's something in there. I saw it. I don't know what it is, but it's in there.
The fear in his voice spiked. I could see by the way his feet kept shifting he was fighting back the urge to run. My mind started buzzing at this point. I started losing touch with reality. My mind fluttered in and out. I saw things I shouldn't have seen. Children playing in the middle of the street, their faces peeling away by an unseen force. People jumping off buildings only to crawl back inside of them with their broken bones and large piles of squirming bodies viciously ripping into each other's flesh. What set me off most, though, were their faces. They had a look of ecstasy to them. The more pain they received, the more pleasure they displayed. My eyes gave in, and I let the blackness take over. I woke under bright artificial lights. There was a bubble of plastic around me, and my body felt broken. I glanced around and saw people dressed in hazmat suits. They were eyeing me with their clipboards.
Joshua A. Jameson regained consciousness in 1704 on the 27th of August, 1984. Muscle spasms have lessened with the introduction of morphine. His eyes show movement and dilation to light. Brain function seems to have returned.
I wanted to speak out, but found a lump in my throat I couldn't swallow. I let my eyes travel to the blockage and saw a large tube going through my esophagus. Even with the medications they were giving me, I couldn't let my mind escape from this place. I felt the adrenaline rush through my veins, keeping me awake. Even so, my body remained still. At this point, I began to wonder if I was paralyzed.
Joshua?
I heard a familiar voice call out.
This is Dr. Hargrove. You and your team were gone for 1 minute and 58 seconds on our end. We managed to reel you in using your life support tubing. Do you remember anything?
Hargrove put on his best sympathetic voice while hiding behind his hazmat mask. I began to feel my vision start to vibrate once more. I could see Hargrove look down at me with disgust before signaling to a nurse to give me more medication. Before I knew it, I was out once more. The next time I woke up, my body responded to my commands. I still felt pain, but it was manageable. This time, I was strapped down to a chair in Dr. Hargrove's office.
Glad to see you awake again, Jameson. Sorry about our previous meeting. I was just a little overzealous for answers. We're confident your condition has improved since then. So tell me, do you remember what happened?
I struggled to talk, but I felt a stabbing pain in my neck. The hole they cut into my throat was still healing.
No, please don't explain. I'd just like simple replies, as in yes or no. Raise your fingers on your right hand if yes, and your left if no. Understood?
I struggled to raise the fingers on my right hand. I felt them crackle and pop under my skin. They felt unused and weak.
All right, Joshua. So back to my first question. Do you...
I cut him off and raised the fingers on my left hand.
Okay, I'll keep note of that. Do you know what happened to your team?
I raised my fingers on my left side again.
Thank you, Joshua. I want to see if it's possible to kick your memory back into action. We have the video recording of what happened out there. I'm going to show it to you, and if by the end of it you remember anything, just let me know.
Hargrove gave a thin-lipped smile before walking over to a television set. He produced a rather large DVD and put it into a video player. I know to most of you this doesn't seem like a big deal, but this was the 80s. DVDs didn't officially exist at this point.
While you were asleep, we went ahead and cut out most of the footage that we deemed not necessary. So let's begin where you entered the city and where you lost consciousness.
The doctor hit the play button and the video started. Immediately, I heard my own voice.
Did you guys say something?
My voice called out to my squad. As I watched the recording, I noted my movements were more rapid than I remembered. I jumped from one thing to the next in a fraction of a second. Eventually, I looked back to my partners and they shook their heads in response. I began to walk a few more feet before stopping again and crying out at my group.
Hey, stop walking. I know I heard something.
I saw the camera jump as I lurched myself forward, raising my weapon close to eye level. The video quickly shifts back and forth between me looking at the rooftops and the nearby buildings. I mouthed the next words spoken by Bobby.
Jameson, by your feet!
The video aimed toward the red sands at my feet. The talon marks still showed up on the video, which brought a faint feeling of relief to me as I continued watching. A loud bang knocked that relief away as Georgie fired off his round. I looked at him as he pointed his rifle towards the glass windows nearby. I looked closely at the footage and swear the shadow inside that building was moving. And by shadow, I mean every damn inch of it. A hulking mass of void blocked out any light from reaching inside. At this point, the camera begins to wobble back and forth as my feet began to lose any sense of sturdiness beneath them. I collapse down to one knee and start to breathe in and out heavily.
Jameson, are you alright?
Yoshi asked, reaching over to me. I looked up at him and nodded. From here on out, I don't remember a thing.
Yeah, I'm fine. Let's keep going.
The voice was definitely me, but I most certainly had no recollection of it. From there, footage sped up. The only sounds that came through were my loud, labored breathing. Every once in a while, my vision would aim towards the sand, exposing more strange footprints. Some just seemed to appear around me. Eventually, my team and I found ourselves standing near the entrance to the skyscraper.
You ready to head in, guys?
Bobby asked as he tilted his head upward at the top of the high-rise.
Let's just get in and get out. If he's not in there, I say we call it quits for the day.
Georgie replied. In the footage, I began laughing before shaking my head. I felt a growing tension rising in my body. I might not remember much, but I knew something was about to happen.
What about these?
I said as I pointed down to our life support cables.
Dr. Hargrove said we have about an hour without them, in which we can move around and explore.
I looked at Yoshi and saw the reflection of my face in his visor. I was grinning.
Alright, we'll take him off and head up.
Georgie said as he loosened his tube. The others followed suit. The camera panned down and showed me undoing the cables on my back. There was something wrong. Right near the small of my back was a tear in the fabric. I had been completely compromised. After we undid our tethers, we entered the building. It seemed simple enough. It was just a dark lobby with a place for a secretary and a large lounge room. We moved past the desk before reaching stairs leading upwards.
There's no way we can walk to the top with all of our gear on. Not under an hour, at least.
I said to the group.
Maybe there's another way.
We walked back near the entrance before spotting two small elevators.
There's no way in hell those are gonna work.
Georgie said as he walked towards them. I heard a snicker come from my mouth before my hand reached out to the call elevator button. With a ding, the doors opened, revealing two small elevator cabins.
I don't believe this.
Bobby mumbled under his breath. I motioned for the group to get together.
We'll start at the top and make our way down. If the doctor isn't there, we might be able to see him through the top windows. It also looks like we're going to have to split off for a bit. Bobby and Georgie, you take the elevator to the right. Me and Yoshi on the left. We'll meet on the top floor.
The crew nodded, their faces showing nothing but trust in my leadership. Please, stop this, Hargrove, I squeaked out, pain filling my throat. No more, please. Hargrove looked over at me with false pity on his face.
Are you remembering, Joshua?
I wanted to say no, but things were starting to come back. Meanwhile, the footage kept rolling. Bobby and Georgie squeezed into the elevator next to ours, while Yoshi squeezed in with me. I heard the elevator next to us click shut, but my gaze turned over to Yoshi.
Are we going, Jameson?
He asked me. There was confusion in his eyes. Once again, I saw my face in his visor. I had an animalistic grin taking over my features. I reached for my rifle as Yoshi pressed himself against the elevator walls. With one swing, I struck him in the face with the butt of my rifle. breaking the pressurized glass shielding and impaling shards through his skull. He crumpled down at my feet, clearly unconscious but not dead. I stared down at his collapsed form and swung my rifle around. I prayed that I'd just shoot him and that would be it, but I knew better. I took my rifle and began jamming the barrel repeatedly through Yoshi's face, each thrust causing me to grunt and yell as if this was somehow Yoshi's fault. Once I was confident in my handiwork, I lifted the barrel of my gun to my face and gave a labored and hefty laugh as his flesh dripped down the metal of the rifle. Soon after, I dragged his body out into the lobby, pulling a chunk of reinforced glass out of the hamburger meat that made up his head. I then walked out to the life support tethers and began to cut each one apart. How I managed that feat leaves my mind boggled. They had hundreds of pounds worth of strength applied to them. Even a gorilla wouldn't be able to cut them into shreds like I had been able to. After a few brief minutes, that deed was done, and I stood up, gasping for breath and laughing. The only cable left untouched was mine. I turned back towards the lobby and entered the bloody elevator. I pressed the button to the second to the last floor. As soon as I arrived, I launched my rifle through the elevator controls and began walking towards the staircase. As I got closer, through the static, I could hear Georgie calling out for Yoshi and me.
Hey, you guys alright? We saw the elevator stop a floor too early.
Yeah, I don't like this.
I said back to him.
We could use an extra weapon down here. Have Bobby provide cover at the top of the stairs and come down here and meet with us.
Roger that.
Georgie said. I felt my stomach lurch. I begged Hargrove to stop the video, but he refused. I heard Georgie's footsteps quickly descend the staircase. I positioned myself behind the entryway so as to not be seen. Georgie walked right by me and never had a chance to defend himself. The shard of glass I used to cut the tethers found itself in the back of Georgie's spine. He collapsed hard against the floor and struggled to breathe. I took the glass from his back before gripping his rifle. I positioned the top of the barrel against the small wound affixed to his spine and pressed down. I could hear the sound of Georgie's spine being crushed under the metal. His body began to spasm the more force I applied. Eventually, the rifle hit a spot with no resistance and pressed down straight through his sternum and into the floor. He stopped moving.
One more. One more. One more. One more.
I kept moaning to myself in the recording. I felt disgusted. It sounded as though pure ecstasy was washing over me. I walked towards the staircase and began sprinting up them. Bobby turned to face me and saw the blood on my suit. He immediately raised his weapon and took a shot. I landed flat on my back and began laughing with lustful energy. I lifted my head up and began to fondle the bullet hole in my chest.
Come on, Bobby. At least make sure you kill me.
I slid up to my knees and heard the popping noises of rounds going off. My white suit now drenched in my own blood when round after round pierced through my body. I craned my neck and looked at my friend. He had emptied his clip and was now trying to reload.
Do you see them, Bobby? They're all around us. Cutting, stabbing, hurting, and loving. Pure emotions. Pure, raw emotions.
I began to get to my feet, blood pouring out of my wounds.
I'll make you see them, Bobby. I'll make you see paradise.
I reached over to the desk and flung it with inhuman strength towards him, knocking Bobby to the floor.
Breathe, Bobby. Breathe.
I slurred out as I slumped towards him. While he writhed on the ground, I lifted up my boot and smashed his visor along with his nose.
10 minutes, Bobby. That's all I ask. 10 minutes. Breathe in and out.
Bobby lay nearly comatose near my feet, but I could see his suit rise and fall with his breath. Once more, the film speeds up. It shows me staring at Bobby and swaying back and forth. After about 10 minutes, Bobby's eyes open with a certain feral fear to them.
Shh, just look, Bobby.
I grabbed his suit and dragged it towards the window, breaking it down with my fists. Glass fell against my suit, ripping it open along with me.
Do you see them? A city full of people getting the most pleasure any of us could ever imagine. Forget God, forget the devil. This is true paradise.
My hands reached out and lifted Bobby towards the window. His eyes widened as he saw things we couldn't see on camera.
Come on, Bobby, it's time.
I struggled out a laugh as my arm shoved Bobby out of the window and let go. A few seconds passed before a loud thud echoed over the empty city.
My turn now. Then your turn, Hargrove.
I choked out another laugh before launching off the skyrise and hitting the ground. That's where the footage stops. I stared at the black screen for a while, with tears running down my face. I killed Bobby, Georgie, and Yoshi. I killed them for no reason, and I couldn't even remember doing it to them. They deserve to be remembered. Hargrove asked me a series of questions, all fairly standard, and most I didn't have a reply to. I knew exactly what happened, but I couldn't conjure up how or why. The biggest question Hargrove had was how I did not only survive that fall, but also tethered myself back up to the life support line. I wish I had an answer for him, but I don't. He asked if it could have been Dr. Carter. Once again, I could only reply with, I don't know. At this point, most stories would end with the big bad government killing me to keep things quiet, but they didn't. They gave me a cushy job dealing with paperwork. They listed my injuries as standard wartime trauma. I was paralyzed from the waist down from the fall. Every time I look down at my wheelchair, I remember them. The only reason they keep me alive is so I can be observed daily for any side effects of my trip. I heard Camp Hero was eventually shut down. Some people say some kid conjured up a monster back in time or something. I don't know. It wasn't my job to know. I do believe, however, our experiment put the nail in the coffin for that place, though I have no idea what happened after I left. I'd imagine Dr. Hargrove gave his speech at the doorway labeled Subproject 23 to a group of new guards that never heard about my team and I. And once Hargrove opens the door for them, they're greeted by a new Dr. Carter, who's bright-eyed and ready to explore.
Do you think we're dead?
I gave Eleanor a perplexed look. I can see your breath, and we're talking right now, so...
No.
She muttered, shivering in the keening wind.
Not here. No sense in asking that here. I mean, out there.
I stared out past the dark sea, reaching to the horizon and likely further still than I could ever conceive of. They say hell is hot. As I sit on the ramshackle heights we fight every day to maintain, the cold clawing at my skin, I truly wish it was. My mother used to say, as long as you tried. Those 5 words hammered strength into my psyche. They once gave meaning in battling hardships and misery. Now, that's a dangerous epithet. You're free to try if so inclined. Just know that none of us will even try to save you when your belly is sliced open and your guts slurped by the creatures that dog this place. We've had our fill of brazen souls out here. They serve to be torn apart in our place. I suppose it's something to be grateful for. The braver you are, the quicker you'll learn. Bravery is as insubstantial as death in this place. I should backtrack. I'm an extremophile. Always have been. Ever since the first time that adrenaline rush flooded my veins, I was hooked. Water sports, base jumping, spelunking, anything you can name is likely under my belt. The one activity I found myself coming back to was mountaineering. Ever since my dad took me up to Mount Snowdon, there's been an inscrutable urge to summit something higher, something steeper and harsher. This leads me to my most recent trip, summiting Monte Rosa's tallest peak, the Duferspitze. My climbing partner and good friend Rob climbed it in 2018. He shared plans of a second summit, so I took him up on the offer. I say climbing partner, but with my skill level, I really mean guide. Rob's expertise blow mine out of the water. Nothing much of interest happened on the drive. Long, boring, standard overall. When we arrived, the parking lot serving as our starting point was empty and quiet. Dead still. There was an air of unease lingering around us. Around me, at least. If Rob felt it, he didn't show it. But it was there. and I should have taken it as a warning. That's retrospection for you. Looking up at Monte Rosa made everything seem so insignificant. Its monster of a rock face stood mighty and gazed out across the landscape. Ants beholden to a molehill in its dominance. God help any who climbs it. Instead, we planned around the Marinelli Couloir, a steep and snow-laden gully. We triple-checked our mandatory gear. Ice picks, crampons, ropes, etc. All present. Clear and cold mornings were forecast for the ensuing week. Perfect climbing conditions. Rob's meticulous planning was impressive, to say the least. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little envious. The mountain hut alone was a 4-hour climb. Though the terrain was forgiving, hard-packed snow crackled below my crampons. A reassuring sound. Inside was cozy. The walls were insulated well, and the wood stove was stocked with more than enough firewood. Yet, even as the fire roared, a chill crawled up my back. Just like the parking lot, we were alone, and the nagging intuition in the back of my mind said that may not be coincidental.
Sure you're ready for tomorrow, mate?
Rob said, glancing over at me from the counter. Why, yep. I'm with good hands, coming with you.
Look, once we get up into the couloir, we ain't turning back, so there's no shame in having second thoughts.
No, it's not that. I mean, yeah, I could come back another time, but who knows how long I'd have to wait. Life's hectic, you know? Might be years till I can try again.
Just making sure. Nerves are a dangerous beast up there. As long as you listen to me, you'll be fine. But remember, don't panic. If you're feeling anxious, remind yourself that getting upset won't help your situation.
Heat from the waning coal coddled my body. Only embers flickered by the time I began to nod off into a deep, dreamless sleep. We set off at 8 a.m. after having oatmeal and berries. The first few hours ended up being a tough trek along the snowfield skirting round toward the collier. Azure sky gazed down through the wispy high cirrus. We were about a mile from the gully when light snowfall started up. It wasn't hugely surprising, being on a mountain and all, but the sky remained clear. If anything, it had grown clearer over the past hour, and still the snow fell regardless. It was such a bizarre sight, I worried I might be getting altitude sickness. As icy pinpricks pelted my skin, the reality of the situation dawned on me. Visibility was dropping by the minute, and within 10, I could scarcely see Rob 20 feet ahead. And then he was gone. I don't mean his silhouette bled away into the whiteout. I mean even his footprints were entirely covered over. I called out to him in a panic, cupping my hands together in a futile attempt to pierce the howling gale. Hoping to catch sight of Rob, I plodded forward another 100 yards or so. Nothing. My next actions I still ruminate over today, forcing me to curse my own cowardice. Even if I was the one who disappeared, I didn't know that at the time. Without Rob to guide me, I thought I was surely going to die. So I turned back. Following the compass, I made a steady descent, hoping to get back to the hut faster than we'd come up. The fresh dusting of snow made frantic steps a danger, and I slipped several times. After an hour, my view was unchanged, pure whiteness. In my retreat, I'd somehow failed to notice a crucial detail. I wasn't going downhill. It seemed like I was in a flat snowfield, but when I turned a full 360 to get my bearings, I understood I was actually facing a gentle incline. A fresh wave of terror crashed down in my mind. I glanced down at my compass, and to my horror, saw the needle replaced by a listless, spinning blur. I tried my best. Mom would have been proud, but the cold wore me down, the snow merciless as it pelted me. My footsteps grew closer and closer together until there were no footsteps at all. I crouched on one knee. I wasn't shivering anymore. Well, I did feel pretty warm, hot actually. I went to unzip my coat when a stark patch of lime caught my attention. An abandoned tent, long left to endure the elements. It looked old. My dulling mind didn't catch the oddity that it wasn't already buried by the snow. Our tent was in Rob's pack, and with him out of the picture, this was my only chance at survival. There were a few small tears in the canvas, but the tent sufficed in its primary purpose. Still, I had no means of warming myself up. Bundled tight in my sleeping bag, I felt the weight of exhaustion settle, and no sooner did my eyelids droop and my eyes rolled back. The fact I awoke at all filled me with a sense of relief. Brain still groggy, I sat up and observed the tense interior. It fared well in the figurative flashbang of a snowstorm. Something was different. The small tears only looked out onto white, but all was quiet. Never has there been a silent blizzard. Only when a cold shock hit my foot did I notice the mounds of melting slush on the floor directly beneath each rip in the tent. I was snowed in. Adrenaline flooded my veins and sent my thoughts into hyperspeed. How long had I been buried? How much oxygen was left in the tent? How deep was I? Don't panic. Freaking out won't help. I took in a deep, controlled breath and crawled over to the zipper, hesitating before tugging it open in one swift motion. White fluff poured into the tent, and in a transitory state between dread and understanding, I scrambled backwards in fear of an icy casket. My mind cleared. Logically, if the snow was that powdery, I couldn't be down very deep. Still, the tent sagged, its backbone long since snapped. I dragged myself out and pushed my way through the dampening snow, lugging the pack with all my equipment behind. With the gap collapsing in on itself behind me, I planted my boots in the snow and stood. I wasn't on Monte Rosa. I wasn't in the Alps. I wasn't even on a mountain at all. Standing near the bottom of a sort of half-cone slope, the horizon-wide expanse of dark water was the first hint I was somewhere else entirely. I could tell the ocean was a ways down, but only after shuffling down to the edge did I catch a glimpse of the precipice. A rugged ice face plummeting some 400 feet. Vertigo struck suddenly, knocking me onto my ass, hands splayed like a starfish. Something sticking up near the edge caught my eye. It resembled the curve rails of a pool ladder. If said ladder was poorly made and rickety, with coarse gray rope tied to each side, graying fibers sequestered by an equally ashen backdrop. A tiny ray of hope beamed somewhere deep down inside of me. Maybe someone was here. I crawled through the powder and gripped the steel bars. My gloves did nothing against the inexorable chill of wind-beaten metal. Still, desperate curiosity willed my head and shoulders to lean over the precipice. Fixed into the mottled ice, a vertical tower of crude materials swayed in the ever-present winds. It reminded me of a shantytown with its hastily flattened planks and battered metal sheeting. For the life of me, I couldn't fathom what reason any sane person would have to build such a thing. Then again, I'd yet to find anything in this place I could fathom. "Hello?" I called out. The first words out of my mouth since waking up were hoarse and weak, tumbling pathetically down the mismatched scaffolding. There was an immediate response from somewhere below. I couldn't see anyone, but there were multiple voices, bleeding together into a garbled slur. Relief warped into regret as I remained hunched, frozen, as if I were some frost-caked gargoyle in a forgotten castle. Though my voice barely cut through the winds, I regretted opening my mouth. I didn't quite know why. The frantic shuddering on the platforms as someone clambered up to meet me instilled a deep, imminent foreboding. I somehow hadn't realized before, but the ropes tied around the bars I clasped onto were actually those of a rope ladder. They whipped into the cliffside, heralding the arrival of the figure who'd just pushed their way out from under a rotten blue tarp. A disheveled and wild-eyed man pulled his way up the wooden rungs, patchy bundles of matted hair swinging around his face. When he saw me, he paused, wired eyes suddenly morphing into something rabid before continuing up the ladder with fervor. As if dislocated, his jaw dropped wide open and flopped around on its hinges. I didn't know what that expression meant, but suffice to say, I was horrified. Those eyes, they betrayed hunger. I flopped onto my back and fumbled with the zipper on my bag, tearing out an ice pick and sleeting myself. 2 sets of blackening fingers curled over the rim before me, followed by this bestial visage of a human climbing up onto the snow in all his wiry might. Hey, what are you doing there, lad?" I chuckled with transparent unease. He almost looked surprised after I spoke, as if language was a foreign concept to him. He sucked air in through his teeth with a hiss.
Cold, so hungry. You, warm, fresh.
He spat in a gravelly voice. I backed up, raising the ice pick clutched in both hands. The man went a few uncoordinated steps before lunging out of nowhere and diving on top of me. I yelped in fear, falling backwards and raising the pick horizontal in defense. Spittle sprayed from yellow teeth, gnashing inches from my face. Acting swiftly, I rammed the blunt handle of the pick into his throat, causing him to recoil. Only a second later, he persisted with all his rage, seeming to shrug off the blow to his jugular as though it were an insect bite. In the scuffle, he managed to grab my right arm and sunk his teeth into my wrist. I screamed and let go of the pick with my right. Instinctively, I swung it in my left, the sharp end sailing true and embedding directly into the side of his neck. Viscous blood exploded over my face as I wrenched the pick back towards me, tearing the front of his throat open in a ragged gash. The man shot up straight in response, stumbling uncontrolled back to the edge and dropping limply into the open air. Despite my close call, something else disturbed me. The blood that had poured onto me was cold. I don't mean lukewarm, cold, if not freezing. No steam rose into the air as one might expect. It just curdled and froze on my clothing. With no other choice, I crept back to the rope ladder and looked down. A ratty woman had just climbed up into view and paused after seeing the man's body on the platform.
Ugh, god damn it. Again, Kurt?
What she said took me aback, but the bubbling laugh from Kurt was the kicker. Throat practically non-existent, he was alive and laughing.
Hey, sorry about him. You can come down. It's safe.
I almost joined Kurt in his hysteria. It was such an absurd proposition. Safe? You're dangling off the edge of a cliff.
Let me rephrase. Safer. Trust me, you don't want to spend another minute up there.
What? Nah, screw this. I'm out of here.
Are you? Are you really? Take a look around. Where in the name of God do you think you are right now?
No idea, but even if my chances are 1 in a million at getting home, I'd rather die out there than stay here.
Me too, traveler. Me too.
With that, the conversation was over. The woman turned her attention to Kurt. I refused to witness any more of this madness and stormed off back up the slope I'd come from. After a few steady paces, I stopped dead in my tracks. Something was off. Imperceptible movement in the snowfield. Distant thuds growing nearer. I squinted to make anything out, but I didn't need to. There, near the buried tent I'd crawled out of, the falling snow outlined an absence. Empty air. A strong gust flung pale dustings off the ground to form a haze, and in it, the shape was clear. I couldn't tell you what it was, only what it resembled. Serpentine in form and of simply vast size, it coiled through the haze the way an air bubble darts through water. 2, maybe 3 sparsely spaced legs jabbed out of the ground, leaving clear imprints of whatever this thing was. Scythe-like mandibles sliced through the air towards me. It wasn't a hallucination. I could hear its sharp limbs clacking, feel its heavy steps through the ground. I reneged on my words and scampered back down the ladder. Vertigo be damned, I couldn't stand up against whatever the hell that thing was. The girl was still tending to the man whose throat I'd torn out and shot a glance over to me.
Told you,
she said with an ill-fitting smile. What the hell is that? I couldn't see it. Well, I could, but...
It's fine. They won't come down here.
I sank to the floor, if it could even be called that, and a sudden wave of despair overtook me. I hadn't the first clue where I was. Something deep in the recesses of my mind doubted I was even on Earth anymore.
I'm Eleanor, by the way.
Shaking, I looked over to her with a grimace, then promptly winced from the pain of freezing wind whistling through my teeth. Nicholas, how are you so nonchalant right now? How long have you been here in this hell?
How long? Hell if I know. Time doesn't have a say anymore. Not for me. It's not as if clocks work here, even if I wanted to know the time. A day could be months, years, and a night could be 5 minutes, or vice versa.
There's not many things a man can do when faced with impossibility. Do you deny, to enkindle self-detriment, or accept and give up so easily? A question of hopeless fight versus hopeless submission.
Look, how about you come down with us, get some shelter? I know it's not optimal, but believe me when I say it's a paradise to living up there.
Before, I had Rob to guide me. Whether he's still in the world I knew or he's here somewhere, I don't know. I should hope he made it out. But the coward in me also hopes to see him in this cursed place, to let him take the lead, and the same cowardice in me chose to stay with Eleanor, Kurt, and the rest. The rope ladder ran down through entry level. A group of us sat on a 9-foot square base of cobbled ply and sheet metal, enclosed by flapping rolls of sun-bleached canvas and tarp. A room by some sliver of a margin. At the time, there were 6 of us. A paler, sharp-faced man introduced himself as Aaron and spoke on behalf of Kurt. The hunger, you see, it breaks you down. However strong you think you are, you'll never win against it. To eat anything substantial is a godsend, let alone something warm. Of the remaining 2 were Naya, a tan woman whose dappled skin displayed mild vertigo, and an older gentleman bearing several tight pink scars over his hands. Same for his face. Well, what could be seen of it past a graying beard. He doesn't remember his name. Everyone calls him Iago or Santiago. Something Hemingway. Never read his books myself, but as far as wind-beaten fishermen go, Iago certainly looks the part. It took a while of idle chatter for me to finally come around to the question seeping through my thoughts. So, how do you survive here? 8 words were all it took to derail the conversation and have them exchanged pitied glances.
Ain't a matter of surviving, son,
Iago rasped.
It's a choice between lesser evils.
I was exacerbated. What does that even mean, you old... Iago's sunken eyes toppled my will, and I trailed off. He huffed, more with fatigue than frustration.
Try as you might, it can't die in this place.
I went to bite back, but swallowed my words as I remembered Kurt. He laid beside us under a dirty sheet. Naya must have caught on because she reached over and tugged the fabric down to reveal Kurt's injury. Now his ruined throat was filled with what looked to be ice, only the ice looked tainted, putrid almost, with sallow mycelia exploding within. Crimson tributaries forced their way through the frost, up on the left, down on the right. Tingling dread crept in a similar manner, up my spine and neck, and flowing back down through my chest. If this was reality now, then, well, I don't know. What moral is there? What sadistic law of nature permits this? With no other choice, I've learned quickly what to do and what to avoid, either empirically alongside my fellow captives or from their lessons. Just whenever we need to, we set out in the snowfield above in alternating groups of 2 or 3. Oftentimes, the invisible creatures moved to someplace new, leaving the path clear for us. I'd let them use my ice picks, though. I'd made it clear that if it was my turn, I'd always have one in hand. The 3rd member used some kind of socket wrench with a sharp stone driven into the end. The iceberg is possibly the most treacherous ground I've ever had to traverse. Fissures hide under deceptive snow overhangs. One misstep on such unstable ground means falling 100 feet into an icy casket. That wouldn't be so bad, since you could eventually climb your way out. Only the boar worms that tunnel deep inside the ice are quick to snatch up anything coming their way. Worse still, those see-through monsters come and go as they please. I myself have been caught, 8 odd times? The way their mandibles carve and cleave, they must be serrated, because it hurts. It really hurts. And I'd rather not experience the sensation again. But we have to go searching. We have to. Most of the time we find little, usually nothing. A beaten metal sheet or frost-blackened planks are cause for celebration. You see, our cliff dwelling doesn't stay by itself. If only it were that easy. No, the iceberg is sinking constantly at a glacial rate into the abyssal brine below. Perpetual snowfall packs itself down into the ice over time and roughly maintains the iceberg's elevation. So we have to deconstruct, dismember the lower levels and lug them back up to the top. drive old rebar into the cliff with blunt objects, and fasten everything back together. If that's not work enough, the whole iceberg sways imperceptibly over time. It tilts forward to precarious angles, resting for a drawn-out solstice before tipping backwards again. Lose your presence of mind, and there's no second chance. Down into the freezing waters you go, torn apart by scaled monsters with their jagged spines and shark's teeth. Never blessed with the mercy of death until every cell in your violated body is torn and strewn asunder. Of course, there's a respite when the iceberg leans backward. It's not something to get complacent with. Listen to that nagging reminder tell you that at some point, you'll be back in the same spot. That's your survival instinct talking, obsolete as it is. And even then, when you feel prepared for anything, this place always has an ace up its sleeve. My first introduction to this concept was, well, it was a while after my arrival. I'd like to embellish the memory, to say we were sitting around a fire, something to that effect. No chance of that. Even behind cover from the wind, it's like the warped physical laws here outright forbid sparks and flames. No, I sat beside Aaron and Naya on a pile of salt-crusted clothes. Without much else to pass the time, we'd engage in half-hearted games and hobbies. Contrary to his appearance, Iago had a strong singing voice. I'm kind of amazed he can remember any songs. The man can't recall his own name for Pete's sake. I guess it's like Alzheimer's. Music's the last to flee memory, or so I've heard. At the time, he stood out on the platform before us. He was singing. I think it was Green, Green Grass of Home. In spite of the choppy gale, his voice carried. It was pleasant. This song in particular rang with poignant nostalgia. Once Iago finished, he stood with his hands held together. Hey, pretty good, old man. Aaron cheered. Naya nodded her head in agreement. Iago chuckled, and for a fleeting moment, our troubles were lost. I guess we were too distracted to hear the heavy shuffling from below, because we fell back to silence when an enormous hand wrapped around the edge of the platform. Whatever pulled itself over that edge, it was no creation of a sane god. Gray, blubbery flesh rippled in the wind. A disgusting, bloated thing the size of a tractor tire peered over at us. A head. Scattered perforations in its side must have been ears, but it had no facial features other than a burbling, X-shaped hole right in the middle. 3 more sets of hands clambered their way up to us, somehow crawling up the ice as if it were a gecko. None of these details held a candle to what their overall features resembled. Infants. Elephant-sized hellspawn toddlers crawling on all fours. Laggardly with age, Iago had no chance. Swollen, sticky fingers curled around his body, squeezing him in a grasp even world record strongmen couldn't escape. The awful harmony they made upon claiming their new plaything is etched into my soul. Gargling coos of childlike elation, deep in pitch and easily drowning out Iago's hysterics. In the brief period before they left, I watched, oblivious to the screams of Naya and Aaron, as the creature shook him around and pulled at his limbs. All I could hear were joints and bones snapping, cracking. The creature holding Iago brought him up to the dribbling hole on its face. The hole dilated, revealing a cavernous passage of dripping flesh, and, with slowness I'm sure was intentional, pushed Iago inside, feet first up to his neck. It closed around him with such pressure I could hear his body breaking, and with crushed lungs he couldn't even scream. And just like that, they descended, leaving us with a cold, empty space shaped like an old man. That's how it goes here. No mercy, just suffering. Endless, indiscriminate suffering. These are a handful of things we can predict, or at the very least, expect. It may be logical to melt the ice and drink it. We are, after all, still subject to thirst and hunger, despite needing no food or water to live. Fresh snow from up above is okay, but the ice is bad water. It's rotten. It putrefies and becomes teeming with disease. In particular, it hosts some kind of parasite. Drink it and they'll start breeding inside you until your organs are rife with them. They sap any moisture they can from your body, drying you into a shriveled husk. Oh, and they're permanent. Literally no way of getting them out. I mentioned borer worms before. They're not an issue most of the time. Sometimes, if you look deep into the ice cliff, you can see them burrowing within. They're lightning fast though, so I can never get a clear picture of them. From what I can gather, they're long, thick, and leech-like. Their heads open up to reveal strangely mechanical sets of spike balls which spin against each other to grind through the ice. I don't know if they're immune to the parasites. Maybe they're symbiotic. Worm eat ice, parasite take water, who knows? This nameless hell has fates of plenty, except one: death. I didn't know how it worked at first, but it later on became clear. Months, perhaps years after Iago's abduction, something happened that was gut-wrenching and incredible in equal measure. About 25 feet from us, the ice began growing outwards. A small mound at first, swelling like rotten pustules. It was when a familiar visage began forming that it clicked, and we built a walkway across. Through some uncouth law of nature, Iago grew in the form of an ice sculpture. Then color flushed his skin, starting at his fingertips and slowly spreading. He eventually broke free with a crack and a pop and fell down into our arms, vacant-eyed and nude. A grotesque and wholly unnatural birth. Iago was never the same after that. Deference held our tongues from prying, until the curiosity got too much to bear. Even when he prodded him, asked him what had happened, not one incoherent word slipped from his lips. I shudder to think about what might have happened during his absence at the hands of those abominations. Things that considered him nothing more than a toy to wear out. We've taken to calling them blubbers. I'd say it describes them to a T. With a honed skill at hiding, they're not too hard to avoid. The problem is hearing them approach before they arrive, because if you don't, well, no need to repeat what's already been said. Past that, a worse revelation came to light. No matter what we do, no matter what happens to us, no matter how violent or peaceful the death, we'll return, spat right back out into the fray every time, no matter what. The brutality displayed in this realm is nothing to be scoffed at, but at the very least, you grow accustomed. Meat and bone lose their sting, and yet there are some things the scars can't toughen you against. One in particular stands out to me. Kurt and I were out on a scouting trip. We'd long since made amends by this time and agreed to let bygones be just that. Plodding along the ridge of a snow dune, Kurt cocked his head to look at something, then grabbed my shoulder with a wary firmness.
Get down. Now.
We both dropped down below cover. I hadn't seen anything, but by now I trusted Kurt's judgment. What? What do you see?
Caught it in the corner of my eye. Thank fuck I ain't look at it.
Without thinking, I went to peek over into the open snowfield. Kurt tore me back by the scruff of my jacket, bringing me to eye level.
The hell's you doing, you fucking oaf? Don't look at it.
I stared, confused. At what?
The uncoupled. Should really get Ellie to go over.
Whoa, slow down. Uncoupled?
Yeah. Don't look too deep into the name. I only seen it in the corner of my vision before. Just a dark shape. Nah, more than that. A stain. A stain on the world.
Carefully, I turned my head in the direction he'd seen it, as if I'd be able to see right through the snow. Okay, if you can't look at it, how do you know?
Been plenty here before you, mate. Knew one or two of them. This kid called, Kent, yeah. He looked. Said it was hollow. Sort of an empty imprint that might have once been a person. I think he said something along the lines of, it's like if you took someone and stripped everything away except their being. Still not sure what he really meant. But it's enough to know I ain't never gonna look at it. Well, that and the fact that a moment later, he's already 30 feet ahead and stumbling toward it.
Pausing to let Kurt's words sink in, I muttered, where is he now? I mean, Iago got taken and he came back. He shook his head, eyes focused on nothing.
Couldn't tell you. Only way I even remember him is because of his voice. Screams. God-awful wailing. Surfing across the dunes and through the air. In those short times when the wind stumbles, if you just listen.
Following his lead, I cocked an ear upward, frostbitten air slicing past my skin. There was nothing other than the howling gale and the hammering of my heart. However, the longer I listened, I picked up on something distinct from the wind whistling. It did sound like screams. For all I know, Kurt could have just been pulling a sick prank. It's easy to hear things that aren't there, to see what you want to see. Only, as I focused, it began to morph into the tone and timbre of a scream I still remembered. One I remembered well. It was the last voice I'd heard before this all happened. I tried not to think about it. "Help me." The words were hissed straight into my ear. It startled me so bad my legs straightened and I hopped off the ground. No question that time, it was his voice. After that, it wasn't a matter of not thinking about it, but of trying to forget. I must have been in a trance when Kurt spoke up again, snapping his fingers.
"Hey, you alright? Come on, we should get back. Ain't seen nothing out there worth the risk. Just, if you ever see something in the corner of your eye, something darker than dark, leave."
I nodded, grimacing, and we made our way back to our home. If constant, freezing snowfall wasn't enough, the weather knows worse cruelty. For the most part, we have shelter if it starts raining anything untoward. If you're caught out in the snowfield, though, well, let's say you'll be back in a few weeks at best, months or years at worst. That happened one time while Eleanor and Aaron went scavenging. They must have been on their way back when it started raining these razor-sharp ice shards, finger-sized blades that sliced through the canvas and embedded deep into wooden platforms. Pain snarls from above heralded Aaron's arrival, the rope ladder quivering under his descent. The best way I can describe how he looked was as if a shrapnel grenade had detonated 3 feet in front of him. Well, all around him, really. Deep, weeping gashes littered his body, and strands of flayed skin danced in the wind. It was like looking at a mangled, human-shaped version of those cheese strings. You know, the ones you peel off. I wish I could taste one of those again. Anyway, there wasn't much more we could do except bandage him up. Even then, it was more so we didn't have to see his injuries. I realized in my stupidity something we'd overlooked. He was alone. Naya asked where she was. He sat there, lifeless. It could have been the bandages wrapped around his head. I think he was just too broken to register the question. With his throat and chest a pulpy mess, Aaron's voice was little more than a grating rattle. "Didn't make it. Ankles, Achilles, all sliced to shit. She fell down a ravine." Naya just stood there, letting her head loll back, and let out a forlorn wail into the sky. One of transparent despair and indignance at this reprobate world. One I felt all too closely. I remembered looking into the ice and seeing torn flesh dangling from a boreworm's mouth. Dull pink smudges carried through the ice as they tunneled. A while later, 2 or 3 weeks at a guess, her rebirth began. It seems that whenever this happens, they aren't too far away. 30 feet tops. I don't want to jinx it, maybe it's luck. More likely, it's just how this place works. I dream sometimes of being reborn from the ice, only to fall out rigid and lifeless. But all we get are failed miscarriages. There's one thing I find worthy of putting on paper, and that is the storm. It happens at random, according to Kurt. There's no pattern to its visits. I've only witnessed it twice in my time here. The first time it swirled on the distant skyline. I found myself totally wrapped in its magnificence, a terrifying sight to behold. We'd been imprisoned in a night that must have lasted at least 2 or 3 years, relatively speaking. And in accordance with the darkness, the only light being the bruised, moonless firmament, it took a while for the black clouds to register, congealing across the waters. Well, it wasn't hard to notice after deep crimson flashes lit up in its bowels. Pulsating vermilion glimmers, so full of energy that I could feel heat wash over my face from across the waters. That heat grew into a roiling whirlwind as the storm neared. The others were quick to stir from their meager shut-eye when they too felt it.
The hell's that?
"Oh no, please God, not again," Aaron croaked. Guys, what's happening? What is that out there?" I asked.
"Storm's coming,"
Yago said. We all turned to him in sync. Those were the only words he'd spoken since he returned from the blubbers, and the mere sound of his voice came as a shock. We pressed for details, but he'd already sunken back into his dead-tongued dejection. Kurt was no help either. He just shivered and stared paralytic into the churning depths of that stormhead. I'll be honest, after the storm drew nearer and patting rain replaced the snow, a certain excitement overtook me. Inky blots darted across the flashing lights deep in the storm clouds, captivating me in awe. I threw my head back and opened my mouth, allowing the rain to splash its warmth across my tongue. It felt heavenly. The sensation of warmth after so long deprived was like nothing I'd felt before. The euphoria was short-lasting, and concern replaced it as the raindrops turned scalding. When they started to burn and sizzle off my face, I flinched and dove back under the cover. Before long, the air was an all-encompassing haze of steam. It was like we'd entered some malfunctioning steam room. Each breath brought with it a flaring heat that spread from my lungs to the rest of my organs. It's funny, isn't it? In winter, it's cold and dreary, and you wish it was summer instead. Then when summer rolls around, the beating sun and stifling nights make you yearn for the colder seasons. In that boiling cloud, I begged for the cold to come back. At least we could layer up in the coats and pants. There was nothing to be done about the heat. You can't exactly take your skin off when it's too hot. Momentary relief came as cool, trickling streams from above. My relief was sorely misguided when I understood what it was. Meltwater. Minor runnels quickly inflated to a formidable downpour, then into a violent rapid. Nothing could be heard over the roar of rushing water. Blind, breathless, and panicking, I reached out for a hold. My fingers wrapped around metal, a pole driven into the ice. I held on with everything I had, but there was a thump beside me, a gurgled shriek. Eleanor. Despite my total exertion to keep from being swept away, I outstretched a hand. "Ellie, grab my hand!" I said, a candle in the wind to the rapids. Without delay, I felt her slippery fingers intertwine with my own. I heaved. I felt as if my spine would snap right there and then. I didn't have the strength. The cold torrent sapped all of the excess energy from my muscles.
Help me!
Following the cry, I barely made out Kurt clinging helplessly to a torn canvas. The steam swallowed him up again, and my stomach knotted when a harsh tearing noise scraped my eardrums. In total, uncut despair, I watched as Kurt plummeted past the platform and out of sight. As if on cue, Ellie's fingers slipped away. My heart felt as empty as my palm. Her screams faded from my ears, replaced by the incessant torrent. I don't remember the wait following, only the waterfall suddenly abating, giving way to a familiar gray murk hanging in the sky. Kurt and Eleanor were gone. In any other situation, I might have found solace knowing they drowned, or perhaps even died on impact with the ocean. Of course, that was out of the question. We were left knowing with absolute certainty they were going through unimaginable suffering, and far more to come. Whether at the hands of unseen leviathans, blubbers, or any other nameless thing lurking in the depths, it didn't matter. I just hoped whatever found them was vicious enough to tear them apart, digest their bodies into nothing, and allow them to return. A week passed, and Eleanor began to regrow. Another 2 weeks later, Kurt appeared. After their rebirth, we all knew better than to prod. Just leave them be. Let them process it. Let them decompress. Loss may seem a trivial affliction without death, but I would be naive to think of loss as a purely physical separation. Yes, you may be taken away, put through unspeakable suffering, and then be reborn, but for lack of a better term, those victims lose some integral part of their being, slowly chipped and whittled away. Something so abstract, so important, yet it cannot be grasped by the hand. Once it's gone, there's no reeling it back. And still, we went on. We had no choice, and fell back on mindless habits for comfort. In a way, we found paltry success in learning what makes this place tick. Trial and error. However awful those trials have been. My thoughts lingered on the storm after it happened a second time. We were seasoned, prepared for what was to come, making sure our cover was uninfiltrated by the elements. We pulled together ropes and twine, tied them around ourselves, and fastened the ends to various driven poles and stakes. Maybe I'd been too focused on the storm and its sizzling droplets to catch Iago unfastening himself and standing up. A yell from Aaron brought me to attention, but it was too late. Iago, already several paces away, lumbered toward the edge of the platform. We all thought he'd jump, futile as it be. He didn't. Instead, he threw off his shoes, socks, jacket, and pants, everything, until he stood stark naked, exposed to the elements. At this point, we knew better than jumping up to help. We had no fault in this. He'd come back eventually, after all. Yet I could sense something changing. I don't know what or when it started, but it was there. A shift, a redirection of energy. Iago howled as his skin bubbled and blistered under the storm's ferocity. I think it was when his skin began sloughing off in great swaths that it happened. Without warning, Iago's entire being burst into a furious red flame, a sparking vermilion plasma crackling with the intensity of lightning. Eyes watering from the heat, I watched transfixed as his silhouette, shrouded in hellfire, seemed to be eaten away into nothing. Not a puff of smoke or steam bellowed from him. His backlit shadow disintegrated inch by inch until the last smattering of fragments were burned away entirely. Absolutely nothing remained of Iago once the storm passed. Not one stray hair or nail fragment. Of course, we expected him to grow out from the ice face, right away in fact. Nothing happened. We scanned every last inch of the cliff. Nothing. It's been... hell, I can't even guess how long it's been since then. It's all so damn arbitrary. Meaningless. Could be decades, centuries, millennia. My family might be long dead by now. Hell, humanity could have already gone extinct. And in all that time, I've yet to see a hint of Iago's return. Maybe he's in another worse place. Maybe he's dead. Or maybe he made it back home. Those are the only possibilities I can imagine. And as far as I can see, that's a 2 out of 3 chance of escaping this place. Escaping eternity. Next time the storm comes around, I think I'll follow that old man's example. Strip down to my most human form, raw for the whole world to see. And maybe, just maybe, the rain will set me free.
When I was 26, my friend and I decided we were going to sail around the world. Ambitious? Yes. Stupid? Yes. As I record this, I am 3.5 years into this journey, with an estimated 2 weeks until I reach home base. I'm not sure if I'll make it. I'll sum up my life story thus far in 3 short sentences. I was lucky to have a nice family growing up, and we lived by the water and loved to sail. After college, I realized I wasn't very happy with myself and needed direction. I thought I'd find answers on the open water, or something like that, so me and my best friend set sail. Samuel and I had saved up a lot of money ever since we were teenagers. We bought a yacht together, aka a tattered 35-foot boat that was built in the 1960s with a nice motor and huge sails. It took some work to get it going again, but it was worth every penny. We had plenty of food, clean water, water purifiers, medicine, flare guns, solar generators, batteries, a professional GPS, all the essentials. We also have a nice satellite thingy that Sam set up so we can have Wi-Fi on board. It only works about 10% of the time, truth be told, but if you're hearing this, it means it's done its job. The past 3.5 years have been, interesting. Some weird stuff has happened, but I don't have time to go over it all right now. The only thing of importance now is surviving the situation I'm in and creating this recorded record of what happened. It started a couple hours ago. Like I said, I'm about 2 weeks away from California, where we started our journey going north away from Mexico into the Pacific Ocean. A few hours ago, Sam and I were sitting out on the boat's deck, sipping some champagne, celebrating the fact that we were in the home stretch. The stars, my God, the stars were beautiful. You really can't get a better view of them than from the middle of the ocean. We were quietly admiring them. We had talked so much in the past 3 years, but the silent moments we shared were the ones I remembered most. Like that moment we were in, silently watching the stars at night and drinking champagne. Or the first morning we set sail. We didn't talk for almost 2 hours as we watched the sunrise, as it first appeared as a red blob climbing over the ocean's end. Sam was strumming "Here Comes the Sun" on his guitar. The salty wind was hitting our face, and I thought, this is it. No coming back. This is the beginning of this whole journey. I thought about these moments and more like them, but I was broken from my daze as I noticed Sam had stood up from his seat rather quickly and was staring off into the dark horizon. "What is it?" I asked. "I thought I saw a flare." I looked out in the same direction he was and waited. A couple of seconds passed, then a skinny, barely visible streak of red appeared. It was a couple of miles away, maybe more. Sam turned to me. "A flare?" I nodded. "A flare. Let's go, now." "Got it." I ran to the controls and started up the engine. We turned the vessel sharply and darted over in the direction it came from. We were traveling fast for sure, but not at an unsafe speed. Our boat rocked up and down and side to side as we traversed the rough waves. Sam and I probably sailed for 10 minutes or so without seeing any more flares and no sign of any other vessels in front of us. "Should we keep going?" Sam asked. Just a little longer, I think." So we did. But this is where things took a turn. No, not a turn. A turn implies the driver is still on the road. No, things didn't take a turn. Things dove off a cliff. "Whoa, slow down!" Sam yelled at me. I slowed down significantly. "What is it?" I see something. I'm not sure yet. Can't make it out." We continued at a slow, steady speed, keeping an eye out. I could see what he saw soon after he pointed it out, but I couldn't make it out. A buoy, maybe? Some scrap from a ship? We approached closer. Wait, no, it's too skinny. Except on top, it's a sign. It's a stop sign. Sam muttered. It was about 10 feet higher than the water's surface. It stood perfectly still as the waves crashed around it. The octagon was red and weathered and covered with rust, but the white letters reading "stop" in the middle were unmistakable. How is it not moving? It was almost as if its pole was stuck into the ocean's floor hundreds of feet below us. "What the hell?" I said. I don't know, man. Let's turn around." I agreed because I didn't like whatever vibe a stop sign in the middle of the ocean was giving off. We turned and passed by the sign once more and sailed away. We were silent again, but not like before when we were sipping champagne. We weren't thoughtful, reflecting, or anything like that. We were scared. I could tell he was. I was, but why? It's just a stop sign, right? Nothing spooky about that. Just weird, just odd, out of place. We continued on for a while, not speaking, until I made a remark about the water. "Wow, the water has really calmed down. These waves are baby waves." "Seriously," Sam confirmed. "This is the quietest the water's been in months, maybe years." He was right, but a chill crept up my neck when I realized how quiet it really was. It wasn't just quiet, it was growing quieter by the second. 20 minutes before, the waves were roaring and crashing into our boat, but they had weakened to small splashes, then had diminished into the faintest sounds of water moving, like a small creek, but then it was silent. There were no ocean sounds at all. If any of you have been out on the ocean in the middle of the night, you know how dark the water really is. It's basically black. The only definition of the waves comes from the moonlight, and you can faintly make out where the waves break and crash. Well, as the sound diminished, so did the waves. The choppy black water had grown stiller and stiller and stiller, and now It was still. It was black. It was flat. It looked like there was no ocean. There was no reflection from the moon or stars anymore. There was nothing beneath our boat but darkness. Sam turned to me. He didn't have words, but his petrified expression confirmed that I wasn't going crazy. We both moved towards the side of the boat's deck and looked down where the water should be. Looking straight down was an odd experience. You know when you look up in the sky and your eyes go for the furthest possible focal point they can? Well, this seemed to go beyond that point. There was nothing but darkness, and I couldn't find an end to it. Sam grabbed my arm. "What is this? What's happening?" "I'm not sure." I turned to him, but then I noticed something far worse. He was no longer backlit by the moon. There were no stars behind his darkened figure. The only light came from our boat's lamps. There were no stars, there was no moon, there was no water. There was only us and our vessel. There was nothing beneath us and nothing above us. The ship no longer rocked back and forth with the water's current. It was perfectly still, absolutely motionless. We floated somewhere in space and time, I know that much, but I had lost all direction. I felt like I was losing my sanity too. I had an odd, out-of-body experience then. It was like I was a mile away from where I stood. I could see the small light emitting from the boat far off in the distance, and surrounding us was nothing but darkness. It looked like we were floating somewhere in outer space, a part of the universe void of any stars or light. I came back from that vision and gained some composure. What does the GPS say?" I asked. Sam ran over to the navigation system's display. "It says..." His eyes were locked on the screen. He didn't finish the sentence. What does it say?" "It says..." He paused again without looking up at me. "It doesn't know where we are." "That's impossible. You said the GPS works everywhere." "Everywhere on Earth, yeah." That gave me pause. "What are you saying?" He still looked at the screen. He ignored my question and asked one of his own. I'll never forget his words. "Does it feel like we're falling to you?" "No," I started to say, but after he asked that, it did. Kind of. Before, it felt like we were floating on stagnant water in complete darkness, but now, I felt that drop in my stomach. My heart was beating faster. It felt like I was lighter, like my feet were barely putting any weight on the deck's surface, like the boat was about to fall away and leave me behind, floating by myself in the dark. No, I reconfirmed, though I wasn't sure what I really believed. It could have been my imagination. I didn't want to accept the fact that we were falling. Falling into what? "No," I said a third time. "We aren't falling, it's just dark. It's messing with your senses." We looked off in the same direction, first towards where the horizon would have been, then down to where the water should have been, then up at the starless sky. We had nowhere to go. I was unsure if the motor would work or if the sails would be of any use. There was no wind, and I was sure there was no water. We were sailing on an ocean of emptiness. What came next was something I'd never experienced before, so I may have trouble explaining. That feeling that we were falling was gone. It had been replaced by a feeling that we were upside down. I don't really know how to describe it. At first, we were upright, not falling anymore, but then we were turning. No, flipping. It felt like the whole boat was capsizing. It kept turning over and then stopped once it felt like we were perfectly upside down. It was still completely dark. There had been no change in scenery to indicate we had turned upside down. Nothing on the boat shifted at all. It was just a feeling. Like in outer space, there's no real up or down, but I'm sure an astronaut would be able to feel if they had been turned upside down. And I could tell Sam felt it too. He turned to me with eyes wider than I'd ever seen them. We didn't say a word to each other. Our locked eye contact was broken by light above us. It slowly appeared, but it was obvious that it was stars. It was the stars and moon in the sky once again. "Oh, thank Christ," I said. But as Sam and I looked upward, I realized we weren't actually looking at the sky. We were looking at a reflection of the sky. It had a slow, rhythmic motion refracting the light in a strange way. Then, I realized we were looking at water. I looked overboard and saw that beneath us was the night sky, beautiful and bright now, unmoving, and above us was the ocean, daunting and dark but reflecting every star off its surface. We were upside down, or we were still upright and everything else had flipped. I turned to Sam, whose expression matched my own, one of shock and confusion, but the word confusion doesn't do the situation justice. It was beyond my ability of comprehending something as a human. He looked at me. His expression had turned to sorrow. He looked like he was about to burst into tears that second. "Help!" he whimpered. And with that one word, I watched my friend fly upward, flail and scream for 10 agonizing seconds, and then splash into the dark ocean above my head. He fell, I thought. He fell up or down into the sea. But I didn't fall. I looked up at the now rough waves and waited for my fate to be sealed, but nothing happened. Not yet. I ran into the cabin and began recording this. I'd come to the conclusion that I was going to die somehow, and soon. I wanted my experience to be recorded for someone to hear, so someone knew what happened to me. I got about halfway through it before I heard the noise. It was a long, slow, loud, deep rumble. It almost felt like a light earthquake. It slowly got louder and louder until I couldn't ignore the fact that something was happening. I peeked outside the cabin door, cautious not to go all the way outside. I looked up at the ocean where I deduced the sound was coming from. The waves were bigger now, rougher too. Those black monsters would crash into one another and produce a light shower of white water. That's when I noticed it's closer. It was, indeed. The water was maybe 1,000 feet above the boat when I first noticed it. Now it was more like 250, and that distance was decreasing fast. I stared at it, stuck in a panic of confusion and fright. It was falling on me, or I was falling on it, and it was happening rapidly. I ran into the cabin again for shelter, knowing it would be little help. Seconds after I secured the cabin door, the ocean fell onto me, or I fell into it. The surface of the water crashed down hard onto the ship's deck and quickly began flooding the cabin. I think the boat was fully submerged underwater for a second at least. I felt the pull from it as it brought itself back to the surface, trying to float. I don't know how or why, but I knew I was upright after that. I'm not sure if the boat flipped itself or maybe a wave helped flip it over. It all happened so fast. I don't know, but I knew I was upright then, floating in the ocean. I got beat up pretty bad. Whiplash, bruises, a couple cuts, maybe a concussion. My boat got beat up worse though. There was about a foot of standing water on the deck. The engine is completely wrecked, possibly beyond repair. The sails were torn to shreds from the impact of the water, but I'm floating upright. That's good. But I'm floating, wandering with no control over my direction. That's bad. And that's where I am now. I'm not sure what happened or what went wrong. I'm not sure if I'll ever make it home. I'm not sure if anyone will ever actually hear this. My GPS isn't working anymore. God knows where I am. I'm just hoping this internet thing Sam set up still works. God rest his soul. All I can do now is send up a couple flares and hope someone rescues me. It's still so dark. I had a strange experience as a young boy that gave me a lot of anxiety during my childhood. While I grew up, it was my go-to story at camp when we sat around the fire, but in my teenage years, and with the help from my therapist, I came to the conclusion that the story hadn't really happened. I convinced myself that I'd constructed the memory based on my earliest nightmares, or perhaps some story told to me before I was old enough to tell fiction from reality. It was a reasonable way to see it. The fact is that you can't really trust your childhood memories, and given how unbelievable this particular memory was, it would have been absurd to still believe in it as an adult. So I stopped thinking about the memory, stopped telling it to my friends, and continued on with my life. At least that was until last week when I was visiting my mother. I found something in her attic, and now I feel compelled to tell my story once again. I was 7 years old. At the time, I lived with my mother in Stockholm. I didn't have any friends, not because I was disliked by my peers, but because there weren't any kids my age in the neighborhood. The other kids were either too young or too old for me. Thus, I usually played by myself in the courtyard. I didn't mind it that much. I had a rich imagination and could entertain myself pretty easily. My mother kept an eye on me through the kitchen window, but it was a safe neighborhood, so she didn't need to worry too much. It wasn't possible to enter the courtyard from the street without a code to the door, and my mother knew the neighbors well enough to trust them. One day, on my way down the staircase, I noticed a blue tricycle in the courtyard. I saw it from the window on the second floor. I hadn't seen it before and thought it would be cool to try it out. However, when I reached the courtyard, I couldn't find it anywhere. I assumed someone must have taken it away, although it would have to have happened really quickly because I had run down the staircase as fast as I could. Disappointed, I decided to climb one of the maple trees, and I quickly forgot about the tricycle. The next day, the same thing happened. I saw the tricycle from the window on the second floor, and when I got to the courtyard, it was gone. I don't remember if it happened a third time before I investigated it, but when I did, I was bewildered to discover that the tricycle could still be seen from the window on the second floor, and only from the window on the second floor. The view from that window was slightly different from the view from the other windows. The tricycle was the biggest difference, but there were other things that stood out too. For example, the bushes weren't as neatly trimmed, and there were cracks on the wall of the house facing the courtyard. Like with most things, I kept this mystery for myself. It was my discovery, a window to my own secret world. At least, that was how I felt. Every time I went outside to play, I took a few moments staring out the window on my way down. One time, a neighbor found me looking out of it. She asked what I was looking at, unable to notice the small differences that had caught my eye. I guess her adult mind simply couldn't find a reason to pay the view from the second floor any special attention. No one did, except me. I told her that I was looking at the birds, even though I didn't see any birds. In fact, I hadn't seen a single living thing on the other side of this window. It didn't register that might have been a bad sign. Instead, I thought it made my secret little world peaceful. I loved to be alone, and the world with the blue tricycle seemed to be the perfect place for it. I don't know how many days passed, but at some point, my curiosity got the best of me. It was October, or at least sometime during autumn, because I remember the yellow leaves on the maple trees. I snuck out of the apartment before my mother woke up. It was right after dawn. I climbed up the window frame in the staircase. A light rain fell over the courtyard, at least over this version of it. The second floor wasn't that high up, but it was still too high up for me to jump out of without hurting myself. Luckily, the window lay just next to the downpipe of the rain gutter, which I could use to climb down. I was a good climber. My mother always tells me I learned to climb before I learned to walk, so it didn't scare me. I still had to gather a lot of courage, though. I usually followed the rules to stay out of trouble, and this was perhaps the first time I did something that I knew my mother would have disapproved of. My hands trembled a little when I opened the window. I have a vague memory of the air smelling strange, toxic in some way. Every time I smell burnt rubber, this memory comes back to me, so I guess it smelled a bit like that. It didn't deter me, however. I grabbed the pipe, feeling my little heart beating hard in my chest, and began my descent. The sound of my feet hitting the ground echoed between the buildings. Looking up at them, the dark windows stared down at me like empty eye sockets.
Hello?
I yelled and listened to my echo. I wanted to know if I was truly alone, and since no one yelled back, I assumed that I was. This place was truly just as empty as I had hoped, but it wasn't as peaceful. The smell made me nauseous. The rain left black dirt on my skin, and the raindrops that landed on my lips left a bitter taste in my mouth. Looking up, I noticed a couple of high-level clouds tainted with a yellow color. I still felt safe, protected from the rest of the city by the buildings that surrounded me, but I still didn't want to stay for long. It wasn't just the smell, it was an overall feeling of something being wrong. I walked to the other end of the courtyard. On one of the walls that I hadn't been able to see from the window, I saw some graffiti. Close the doors. I might be remembering the exact phrase wrong, but I'm sure it said something like that. There was a heap of clothes lying next to the wall. I thought they must have belonged to someone. There had been people here once, I thought. Where did they all go? This question terrified me. I really wanted to try out the tricycle, but after seeing those clothes, I decided against it. It was time to go home. On my way back, I noticed something shiny hidden under the rotten leaves on the ground. I bent down and picked it up. It was a golden ball, the size of an apple. Fascinated, I stared at it. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I almost forgot about where I was, but just moments later, the sound of something crashing to the ground came from behind the building, somewhere on the street. I froze with fear. Something living was moving around on the street behind the building. It made a noise that sounded like a cooing of a pigeon, but much deeper. Another crash. It was the gate to my apartment building, the one leading directly to the courtyard through a tunnel. I stood at the wrong side of the entrance and didn't dare to run past it. The cooing echoed inside the tunnel. Something was slithering its way through it. It sounded like someone was dragging a huge sack on the ground. I hid in the bushes and held my breath. The racing beat of my heart pulsated through my entire body. I was shaking, and when I saw the thing coming out of the tunnel, I wanted to scream, but I kept silent. A huge arm appeared from the opening of the tunnel and grabbed the ground. It pulled its body forward a few meters, but not enough for it to come outside. Another arm, its left arm, extended out of the tunnel and pulled the body far enough for it to exit the tunnel. It wasn't really a body, though, rather just an enormous gray head with some lonely, long black hairs. It was as big as a truck, and the long arms were attached to where its ears should have been. It had 2 golden orbs as eyes, and its mouth revealed enormous, sharp teeth. It formed an O with its mouth, going as it sniffed the air with its long nose. It pointed its face towards me, but it didn't seem to see me. I wanted to cry, but forced myself to keep dead silent. Since it didn't have any ears, it probably wouldn't have been able to hear me anyway, but in my state of panic, I didn't think about that. It began spitting something in different directions. One of the things landed just next to me. It was a golden ball, just like the one I had found under the leaves. Seeing my reflection on its surface, I realized they were eyes. That's why it had come when I found the first ball, and that's why it had found me now. It began to crawl toward my hiding spot, licking its lips while cooing excitedly. I had to run. I closed my eyes for a second and then bolted for the pipe. As soon as I appeared in front of its larger eye, it began to scream like an infant, but much, much louder. I didn't look back, but I could hear it rapidly dragging itself after me. With shaking hands, I grabbed the pipe and began to climb. The screams from the saggy, gray head hurt my ears. When I was just about to climb inside the window, the creature was beneath me. It reached for me with both of its unnaturally long arms. My eyes were burning from the muddy rain that fell into them. I screamed out in pain and terror and blindly pulled myself inside, a fraction of a second before the creature would have grabbed me. Somehow, I don't remember how, the window cracked as I fell down on the granite steps of the staircase. There was a loud bang, and the crying from the monster outside stopped in an instant. I got up, rubbed the rain out of my eyes, and looked outside. The blue tricycle was gone, and so was the slithering beast. My own world had returned outside the window, possibly because it broke. I got into trouble for sneaking out and for breaking the window. I'm not sure if I ever told my mother the story at the time, but if I did, she most likely took it as a way for me to escape my responsibilities. As I said, over time, I stopped believing the story. I blamed my wild imagination. After all, it was the most reasonable explanation. But last week, I visited my mother to go through my old stuff before she gifted it away to charity, and that was when I found it. There was something heavy in one of my old toy boxes. I swallowed nervously. A drip of sweat ran down the side of my head, and I opened the box with trembling hands. It was the golden ball that I had found that day. I saw my reflection on its shiny surface. It instantly felt as if someone or something was watching me from far, far away. Or maybe just from the other side of a window.
If you walk through a certain run-down inner-city area located in a working-class northern town, there's a chance you'll stumble across a terraced street like none other. I say there's a chance, but in reality, it's a slim one. That's because, technically speaking, Purgatory Street does not exist. At least, not in our plane of existence. You won't find it on any maps, and none of the locals will speak about it with outsiders. There are only whispers of its existence in the back rooms of working men's clubs, bingo halls, and greasy spoon cafes. It's taken on a life of its own, however, becoming an urban legend across the towns and cities of the north, with rumors eventually reaching people like me through obscure internet forums. I regard myself as an amateur urban explorer and paranormal investigator. Most of my family and friends say I have too much time on my hands and I'm wasting my life chasing after ghosts and ghouls in abandoned buildings and dark country lanes. And after years of dead ends and disappointments, there were times I thought of giving up my unusual hobby, but then I walked the street and my life changed forever. I would like to say there's some set of rules or magic formula you can follow to visit the street. If there is such a way, nobody's ever been able to identify it. In the real world, the location is wasteland, a gravel-covered empty lot plagued with weeds, rats, and assorted rubbish. It's unclear who owns the land. The council has nothing to do with the site, and no private developer has ever tried to build on it. When you ask the local residents about the land, you'll receive a stony response. It's as if there's a conspiracy amongst the residents to keep this dark secret from the outside world. And they will react with hostility whenever someone like me comes around and starts asking questions. There's no set time and date when you can turn up and the wasteland magically transforms into the paranormal street of legend. Some say that the street chooses you, only allowing a select few to walk its cobblestones. In any case, 999 out of 1,000 times you'll visit the location and find nothing but weeds and piles of dumped rubbish. But despite the numerous disappointments over the years, I kept on returning. I guess there was something pulling me back to that place, and in the end, my persistence was rewarded. But as the old adage goes, you should be careful what you wish for, because you just might get it. It was almost midnight on a cold Saturday evening when the street finally opened up to me. I almost didn't go that night as I was exhausted after working a double shift at my day job, but I still braved the elements and dragged myself out to the site. And when I saw it, my heart almost jumped out of my chest. The strip of wasteland was gone, inexplicably replaced by 2 rows of red brick terraced houses set along a street paved with old-fashioned cobblestones and dimly illuminated by gas lamps. It was as if I was looking back in time, casting my eyes upon a working-class street of the industrial era. But this wasn't what concerned me the most. The entrance to the street appeared as a transparent, liquid-like portal, a doorway to another dimension or plane of existence. I stood there in astonishment for some time, barely believing my eyes as I realized I was looking upon another world. I was briefly distracted by a sound, so I turned around, looking across the real street where I stood and seeing a young couple staggering along the pavement, presumably returning home after a night out. They looked at me suspiciously, whispering and snickering at each other as they passed. I realized that they couldn't see what I could. Otherwise, they would have reacted very differently. This vision was only meant for me. I waited until the drunken couple had disappeared from sight before turning back towards the mysterious street. For a moment, I was unsure how to proceed. The accounts I read from the few who'd claimed to have visited Purgatory Street were typically vague, and so I wasn't clear on how one would enter and exit the supernatural realm. The membrane, or whatever it was, looked inviting, but appearances can be deceptive, and I didn't know whether I could safely cross over and make it back again. Part of me felt like turning around and leaving. I had seen that Purgatory Street did exist after all, and perhaps this was enough. But no, I'd come this far, and I knew I couldn't give up now, so I took a deep breath and stepped forward, cautiously lifting my arm and putting my hand through the membrane, watching in astonishment as the surface rippled like a pond of water broken by a dropped pebble. I saw my hand on the other side, relieved that it was still connected to my body. Reassured, I continued to walk, submerging my entire form in the liquid membrane. For a second, I couldn't breathe, and so I feared the worst, but then I emerged on the other side, stepping out onto the cobblestones of Purgatory Street. Relieved, I breathed the air, sensing that it was somehow different to my world, but not really understanding why. Still, it was a case of so far so good. But now I had crossed over, and I needed to make sure I could make it back. Without turning around, I took a step backwards, and then another, once again passing through the portal before finding myself back on the real street in the mortal realm. I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to return, but thankfully this wasn't the case, as I could step across and back without any problem. And so, after all these years of trying, I had finally discovered something extraordinary. I was very excited, but also nervous, not knowing what lay before me or how long the portal would stay open. But I was determined to explore the street and uncover its secrets. And so I moved on without delay. And this is what I saw. The street itself is like a throwback to a bygone era. It's difficult to place it precisely in the historical context, as there are a number of anachronisms. What you do see when you first step foot onto the road is rows of 2 up, 2 down terraced houses on either side of the street, their front doors opening right out onto the pavement. The lamps lighting up the road appear to be gas rather than electric, although I have no idea who maintains them. In addition to the houses are 2 establishments of note, a corner shop and a backstreet pub, the types of small businesses that are sadly disappearing in the modern world. At first glance, the street has a quaint and almost idyllic appearance, but as you've probably already guessed, this small community holds many dark secrets. As I've already explained, the top of the street is a portal leading back to our world. The other end, however, well, that was something of a mystery. When I looked down the road, I saw a thick mist beginning just after the last set of gas lamps. It formed a thick membrane that I couldn't see through, and it was disconcerting to think about what lay on the other side of the fog. But this was a problem for later. I walked cautiously down the dimly lit street, feeling increasingly uneasy as I progressed. I had the feeling that I was being watched by hostile eyes, and when I looked to the windows of the houses, I swore I could see dark outlines of shadowy figures standing just behind the curtains. I jumped when I saw a set of curtains twitch and a face emerge from the darkness, a ghostly white, almost inhuman face with black, shark-like eyes staring at me. I recoiled in horror, but couldn't look away. It was as if those devilish eyes were holding me in a trance, and against every instinct in my body, I found myself slowly walking towards the window, listening intently as the creature whispered softly through the glass. It repeated the same line over and over, its red lips emitting a low, unnatural voice.
You don't belong here. You don't belong here. You do not belong here.
It screamed so loudly the third time that I fell backwards onto the cobbles, landing heavily as the creature cackled cruelly at my misfortune. I glanced at the portal entrance and for a moment considered fleeing back to my own world, but I didn't. In the tales I'd heard and read, paranormal realms such as these were often protected by a harbinger, a supernatural entity tasked with scaring off visitors from the mortal world. They would go out of their way to frighten the likes of me, but the stories say that they can't do us any harm. I hoped the accounts were correct and summoned the courage to stand up and face the beast.
Leave this place.
No, I replied defiantly. Not until I'm finished. It reacted with anger, its eyes widening and fangs exposed as it hissed like an angry cat. For a moment, I thought I'd made a terrible mistake as I imagined the beast smashing through the thin glass and devouring me right there on the cobbles. But instead, the creature retreated, snarling once again before it disappeared behind the worn curtains. I breathed a sigh of relief as I turned back to the streets, reacting with surprise when I saw two figures standing on the pavement watching me closely. They were two elderly ladies dressed in heavy winter coats and with shawls covering their heads. Their hair was white and their skin wrinkled, but the ladies had eyes filled with expression and intelligence. I noted how both carried wicker shopping baskets covered with kitchen towels, and they stood on the pavement outside the doorway of number 7.
Good for you, son.
Called out the woman on the right.
Good on you for standing up to that vile thing. It's high time he got taken down a peg or two.
I soon realized she was talking about my encounter with the entity in number 3, and wondered what she knew about it, but part of me was afraid to ask. Thanks, I muttered as I cautiously walked across the cobbles toward them. Both women seemed friendly enough, greeting me with smiles and waves. However, this was far from a normal situation, and I suspected the old ladies were not what they appeared to be. Nevertheless, I had embarked on this quest knowing the risks, and had a feeling these women could provide me with some answers.
I'm Mavis, and this is Alice. Nice to meet you, young man.
I nodded my head and smiled thinly. Good to meet you both. Do you live on the street? I inquired. Mavis laughed before replying.
Oh yes, young man. We've lived on this street for a long, long time. Not much happens around here without us hearing about it.
I nodded my head in understanding. Mavis and Alice reminded me of the neighborhood gossips, the types who would always be standing on the street corner and watching all the comings and goings.
You're not from around here, son, are you?
Asked Alice, even though she surely already knew the answer to her question. No, I replied hesitantly. I'm from back there. I pointed towards the portal at the top of the street, wondering if they could see what I saw. Alice nodded her head in apparent understanding.
Ah, you're from the other side. It's been a long time since we've had anyone visit from over there.
I expected follow-up questions, but instead, Mavis and Alice shared a look, and I saw a terrible sadness in their eyes. A tense pause followed before I broke the silence. So, do you like living here? It was a stupid question, but evoked a response nonetheless, as both women began an animated conversation while almost forgetting I was there.
This used to be a nice street. Not anymore.
Alice exclaimed, her old eyes lighting up with a mixture of passion and anger.
There was a time you could leave your doors unlocked and walk alone after dark. No longer, I'm afraid.
Oh, yes.
Mavis agreed whilst nodding her head.
It's all gone to hell. That Mr. Smith in number 13. You know he beats his wife and kids after he's been on the drink.
Shameful. And that's not the half of it. What about Sally in the pub? Don't get me wrong, it's a terrible tragedy what happened to her, but now she's really lost the plot.
You're right there. And what about Mr. Rashid? He used to run a respectable business. But there's something very strange about that man. I won't be patronizing his shop again, let me tell you.
Oh, me neither. And don't get me started on that young hoodlum from number 33. They're calling him Billy the Kid these days. Did you know that?
God help us. He watched too many of those damn Western films, I suppose.
No discipline in that household. They let him run wild, terrorizing the whole street. Where's it going to end?
My tired brain was nearly fried with the deluge of information. I wanted to ask for more clarification about the street and its residents, but fate intervened. I saw the projectile out of the corner of my eye, ducking instinctively as it missed my head by mere inches. Next, I heard glass shattering against the cobblestones. I looked around and saw a young boy wearing shorts, a ruffled shirt, a peaked cap, and with a thick scarf tied around his neck. There was a wickedness in his eyes as he laughed cruelly, although I suspected he was disappointed that the bottle he'd thrown missed its mark. Mavis waved her fist at the boy and shouted in anger, crying,
"Damn you, Billy! You're a bloody menace!"
Alice calmed her friend down, placing a hand on her arm before saying,
"Come on now, Mavis. Let's get indoors before it gets worse."
And with that, they escaped into number 7, slamming the door shut behind them and leaving me alone on the pavement. Shocked at the lady's sudden retreat, I shot the boy an angry glare, only to be met with a one-finger salute and more mocking laughter. I lost my temper at this, shouting, "You little bastard, come here!" The boy started to run, and I foolishly chased after him, not stopping to think about that it could be a trap. I saw him darting into a doorway and disappearing from sight. I followed, only briefly looking up to see a sign hanging above the door which read, "Mr. Rashid's Newsagents and Grocers," and I noted the miniature flags, newspapers, and stacked cans displayed in the shop's window. I entered through the door and scanned the shop's interior, frantically searching for the boy but not finding him. But by this time, Billy the Kid was the least of my concerns. There was something very wrong with this corner shop that quickly became apparent to me. The first thing that hit me was the awful smell, one of rot and decay. It was so bad that I almost retched, and then I realized I was being watched. I slowly turned around and saw a man who I guessed was Mr. Rashid, a middle-aged, bearded fellow of South Asian descent. He had a wide, unnatural grin which seemed to be painted onto his face. This was disconcerting, but what really concerned me was the striped apron he wore over his clothes, which I noted was covered in bloodstains. But Mr. Rashid ran a grocery store, not a butcher's. The shop owner greeted me amicably, at least on the surface, although I could tell there was a sinister undertone to his words.
"Good evening, sir. Welcome to my humble store. And how may I help you today?"
His greeting took me off guard for a moment. I struggled to find the words to respond. I saw a young boy running in here. He threw a bottle at me on the street. Did you see him come through here?" Mr. Rashid shook his head, his smile never faltering as he answered,
"Goodness gracious. No, sir. We don't allow troublemakers in this establishment. But since you are here, why not take a gander at our fresh produce and see if there's anything that catches your eye? I guarantee we have the best prices in town."
I almost laughed as I looked around the store's interior, soon realizing why it smelled so bad in here. Far from being fresh, Mr. Rashid's stock was in a state of decay. The fruit and vegetables brown and rotten, and the milk soured and curdled. In fact, the entire shop interior was in complete disarray, with the ancient newspaper yellow and crumbling, and the labelless cans dented or smashed open. Amazingly, Mr. Rashid seemed totally oblivious to the mess, smell, and general chaos as he continued to stand behind the till with that inane grin on his lips. But I sensed there was worse to come, a terrible secret yet to be revealed. The stench grew worse as I walked down the aisle and towards the back of the store. I spotted an ancient white refrigerator, which I guessed was out of order because my nostrils were hit by the new odor of rotting meat as I approached it. I turned to see Mr. Rashid watching me, a nervousness now evident behind his otherwise amicable expression. "What's inside here?" I asked. The shop owner's smile faltered for the first time as he answered,
"Take a look inside if you so wish."
I didn't want to open that fridge door, not really, but I felt compelled to do so. Reaching out with a shaking hand, I slowly turned the cold metal handle and pulled the door open, recoiling in horror at what I saw. The shelves inside were packed with rotting meat, the fridge's mechanism broken, and the meat infested with maggots and black flies. But as disgusting as the sight and smell was, this was not the reason for my horror and revulsion, because stacked on the shelves were arms, legs, internal organs, and a human head, its eyes missing from their sockets, and its mouth open and full of wriggling maggots. I retched, retreating in utter disgust as I turned away from the revolting scene, and I glared back at Mr. Rashid, whose face was now filled with guilt and shame. I continued to stare at him in disbelief, remaining silent as he uttered out his confession.
"You have to believe me. I'm not a murderer. I never meant for this to happen."
He wiped the sweat off his brow before continuing.
"I came to this country with good intentions, to start a business and raise enough money to bring my family over. But the pressure, the loneliness, it was too much for me.
He pointed angrily towards the dismembered corpse in the fridge.
This man broke into my shop late one night. I caught him in the act of stealing from my till. We fought and I guess my anger got the better of me.
He lowered his head, no longer able to meet my eye.
I knew the police would never believe me, so I vowed to get rid of the body. Please, sir, you must believe that this was never my intention.
Tears were rolling down Mr. Rashid's cheek as he finished his sorry tale. I was left speechless upon hearing this tragic confession. What did he want from me? Redemption? Absolution? I could give him neither. Instead, all I wanted to do was escape from this hellish corner shop, and so I looked past the grieving Mr. Rashid into the door. I feared he wouldn't let me go now I knew the truth, but suddenly there was a distraction as a half brick smashed through the shop window, showering the interior with shards of sharp glass.
Leave me be! Leave me alone, damn you!
I took the opportunity given to me, running for the door and darting back onto the street, leaving the stench and death behind me. I found Billy there waiting for me, soon realizing that he'd thrown the brick that had smashed Mr. Rashid's window. The kid continued to mock me as he ran down the cobblestones. I followed him, although I no longer felt anger towards the young lad. His brick attack had allowed me to escape from Mr. Rashid's shop, and now I wondered if he was guiding me down the street, acting like some kind of cross between a hooligan and a ferryman. In any event, I decided to keep following the boy, even though I feared where he would lead me. I watched as the lad dashed into a doorway halfway down the street, but I paused before entering, seeing the sign above the door which read, "The Bucket of Blood." The windows were frosted, and the swing door closed as the boy disappeared inside. I soon realized that, despite its unappealing name, this establishment served as the local pub house, a backstreet boozer of the sort you used to find all over working-class areas. Based on my experience thus far, I didn't know what to expect when I entered the pub. As soon as the door swung open, I was hit by the smell of tobacco smoke and stale alcohol. Not the most inviting of aromas, but certainly an improvement on the rot and decay in the corner shop. At first glance, the pub's interior was surprisingly ordinary, adorned with wooden fittings, neat little booths, and with a bar stacked with labelless bottles of liquor and beer pumps. The walls were decorated with old black and white photographs of dour-faced workers and their families, and all seemed to stare down at me in a somewhat sinister fashion. The bar room was almost empty, the only patrons being 3 burly men drinking at the end of the bar, all wearing dirty overalls and with hardened looks on their face as they sipped from their pints. They ignored me as I walked up to the bar and was greeted by the proprietor.
"Evening, love. What are you having?"
I looked to the woman serving me, a lady in her mid to late 30s. She was attractive, wearing makeup with her blonde hair done up in a neat bun. She wore a white lace blouse and dark skirt and shot me a friendly wink and a smile, her eyes green and passionate, although there seemed to be a sadness behind her welcoming demeanor, and I sensed there had been tragedy in her past. Nevertheless, I took the lady up on her offer, taking a stool and replying, "A pint of bitter, please."
"Sure thing, love,"
she replied with a smile, grabbing a clean glass and pouring my beer. "You're Sally?" I asked sheepishly, remembering the old lady's conversation.
"That I am. And we've been expecting you, love."
"Yeah?" I answered in confusion.
"Oh, yes. News travels fast on the street, and it's not often we get visitors from the other side."
She laid the pint down on the bar in front of me.
"On the house, love."
"Oh, thank you."
"Not a problem, love. But just remember, this is a local boozer and we're a tight-knit community. We look after our own around here. Now, I'm not saying you're not welcome, love, but just make sure you behave yourself."
Her expression had become more hostile, and I could tell she was giving me a warning. I struggled to find the words to reply, but Sally had already turned her back on me. She diverted her gaze to a framed photograph hanging behind the bar. I glanced across, feeling like I was intruding on a private moment. The picture showed a smiling and happy Sally on a beach alongside 2 laughing young children in swimsuits, a boy and a girl. There was a tear in her eye as she looked upon the photograph, and I wondered what story was behind the picture. Just then, the pub door shot open and a newcomer entered. I looked up to see a dark-haired man dressed in work overalls, muscular and with rugged good looks. He grinned as he approached the bar, exerting an arrogance as he swaggered up to the stool and put in his order.
Evening, Sally, my darling. My usual, please.
The landlady shot him a look that could kill before responding.
All right, Neil. I don't want any trouble tonight. Do you hear me?
Neil simply shrugged his shoulders, shooting Sally a wink as he said,
Oh, you know me, darling. I'll be as good as gold.
Sally snorted, but poured him his pint nevertheless. I was getting some bad vibes off this guy and tried to avoid his eye, but Neil looked over at me and started a conversation.
Hello, mate. Neil Smith's my name. You must be this fella from the other side we've all heard so much about.
Yeah, that's me, I confirmed, wondering how every person, spirit, or entity on this street knew all about me.
Welcome to the neighborhood, my friend. Although I've got to warn you, it's bloody dead around here.
He laughed boisterously at his own joke while I smirked awkwardly. Next, Neil glanced across at Sally, who was once again staring at the family photo behind the bar.
Still living in the past, Sally. About time you moved on, I reckon.
The landlady shot him a furious look and spat out her angry rebuttal.
Go to hell, Smith!
She retreated to the back room and Neil smirked cruelly. Are those her children? I asked, pointing up at the photograph.
They were. The poor blighters died in a fire.
Jesus, I swore, suddenly gaining some understanding of the landlady's pain.
Aye, was a tragedy, all right,
said Neil, shaking his head.
I have kids myself, you know. It'd be terrible to lose them like that. Still, you should see what old Sally did to the lad who set the blaze. Oh, she got justice for the wee ones, don't worry about that.
He laughed again as he took a gulp from his pint. I saw a sour expression come across his face as he stared at his glass.
How's your pint?
Fine, I answered in confusion, although in truth I hadn't touched my drink.
Nah, mate, the beer is off. Oh, I'm sick of this piss water. I work hard all day to provide for my family, and this is what I get. Sally!
I was shocked at how angry Neil had become as he descended into a furious tirade over something as trivial as a pint of beer. The landlady stormed out of the back room, meeting her aggressive customer head on.
What is it now, Smith?
The pint is off. I want a new one.
There's nothing wrong with my beer. Quit complaining.
Neil slammed his pint down heavily on the wooden bar, spilling about a third of the liquid. He snarled his next words through clenched teeth.
Get me a new pint, you bloody bitch!
I gasped in astonishment at how fast this had escalated, but I watched on as a stone-faced Sally lifted up the pint glass, calmly lifting it above the sitting Neil and emptying the contents over his head. Once Neil recovered from his shock, he launched himself across the bar, reaching out to grab Sally's throat. I jumped up from the stool, thinking I had to intervene, but a moment after, Neil was grabbed roughly by a trio of drinkers who'd suddenly jumped up from their seats, and the men started beating the living crap out of Neil, punching and kicking him without mercy as his blood and teeth spilt onto the wooden floor. Neil screamed as the men dragged him to the back door, and Sally cried,
Get that bastard out of my pub!
I was horrified by the sudden descent into violence, but worse was to come. As a moment later, the glass window at the front of the pub shattered and a firebomb was thrown inside, smashing onto the wooden floor and instantly setting it alight.
Oh dear God, no! Not again!
Sally screamed as sheer terror overcame her. Soon the fire spread and the bar room was filled with smoke. I stayed low, coughing profusely as the smoke entered my lungs, but somehow making it to the door and back out onto the street. Of course, Billy was there waiting for me, but for once he was not mocking or laughing. Instead, he looked incredibly guilty as he watched the fire take hold. He saw me and fled, and I quickly followed, watching as he disappeared into yet another open doorway. I looked to the house number and saw it was number 13. Not a good omen. I stood for a moment on the pavement before a large figure emerged from inside to greet me, and to my surprise, it was a face I recognized. Neil Smith darkened the doorway, his previous charm gone as he cast me a disparaging look. I'd seen him beaten half to death, but now he didn't have a mark on him. What's more, he didn't mention anything about our previous encounter only minutes before, although he did appear to recognize me.
Here you are then,
he said without enthusiasm, barely concealing the hostility in his voice.
You best come in then. The missus is about to serve dinner.
I didn't want to follow him inside, as I'd already seen the man's violent side, but I felt compelled to enter number 13 and face whatever horrors lay inside. What I found surprised me, because I was confronted by an oak dining table where a family sat waiting to eat. There was a boy about 14 or 15 and a girl under 10. Both bore a passing resemblance to Neil Smith, and so I assumed they were his children. The two children looked up at me suspiciously as their father took his place at the top of the table. No introductions were made, and I felt uncomfortable in their presence. My feelings of discomfort only increased when Neil's wife walked in from the kitchen holding a heavy copper pot in both hands. She was a young woman with long dark hair and a pretty face, but she looked tired and bedraggled. Mrs. Smith reacted with shock once she saw me, jumping and almost dropping her pot. She nervously looked at her husband and asked,
"Who's your friend, Neil?"
Her husband glared at me as he replied,
He's a visitor from the other side.
Oh.
His wife replied, as if this one off-the-cuff comment answered all her questions.
Well, you best sit down then.
I took a chair at the end of the table, watching nervously as Mrs. Smith opened the cooking pot, using a ladle to dish out a stew of boiled meat and potatoes. I thanked her as she piled the food on my plate. It did not look appetizing. The stew appeared to be made from offal and cheap cuts. Besides, the gruesome scenes I'd witnessed in Mr. Rashid's shop meant I'd lose whatever appetite I might have, and I was turned by the sight and smell of the meal. Thankfully, no one seemed to care that I wasn't eating as the family all tucked into their food. They ate in silence for several minutes before Neil abruptly spat out a chunk of tough meat onto his plate.
Damn you, woman!
He shouted aggressively, directing his anger towards his long-suffering wife.
I work hard all day and come home to this tripe! You can't bloody cook! Can't do anything right! Why the hell did I ever marry you?
I felt the tension rising inside the small room and feared where it would lead. Mrs. Smith winced at her husband's cruel words, but there was a spark of defiance in her eyes when she answered him.
Well, Neil, maybe if you didn't spend all of our money down at the pub, I could afford to buy better food.
I could have cheered after hearing Mrs. Smith's witty retort, but I'd seen her husband's bad side, and I knew he would react with violence. To my horror, I saw his face turn red with fury as he swiped his plate onto the floor and launched himself across the table, grabbing his wife by the throat. The young girl screamed and the room descended into chaos. There was no one to stop Neil's violent attack this time, no one but me. I desperately reached out in an attempt to hold Neil back, but when my hands touched his body, I felt a surge of pain run through me, and I collapsed onto the floor in agony, paralyzed by some unseen force. Meanwhile, Neil continued the brutal attack on his wife, knocking her down and wrapping his enormous hands around her throat, strangling her right there on the kitchen floor. I couldn't move and couldn't look away as the horror unfolded before me, but suddenly a new figure emerged with a blade in hand, stabbing Neil in the back in a desperate attack. I looked up in shock to see Neil's son, the knife still in his hand as his father cried out, releasing his grip on the woman's throat and spinning around. He moved to attack his teenage son, but instead got stabbed a second time in the belly. The blood poured from his wounds as Neil's huge frame collapsed heavily to the ground. In that instant, I regained control over my faculties, jumping up and running to Mrs. Smith's side. But it was already too late, as the life had been choked out of her. Her face a ghostly shade of pale, and her dead eyes staring up at the ceiling. Her husband/murderer was still alive, however, although barely, as he bled heavily from his deep stab wounds. He looked at me, struggling to speak his last words before he bled to death.
It wasn't me,
he spluttered.
There's a demon inside of me, but now I'm finally free of it.
And then he choked on his own blood and closed his eyes. My whole body shook as I tried to come to terms with the shocking violence I'd just witnessed. Instinctively, I looked to the children to see if they were hurt. What I saw was the crying girl being comforted by her older brother. He held out the bloody knife towards me, threatening me as he cried out in fury.
God damn you, outsider! You come to our home to watch our suffering. How dare you? You don't belong here. Get out before I kill you too. Get out!
I looked into the boy's rage-filled eyes and knew he meant it, and so I turned on my heels and ran out the door, soon finding myself back on the street. I felt an intense shame in that moment, because I knew Neil's son was right. I had made a great effort to come to this realm and see the horrors it contained. I was a tourist here while they had no choice but to live through the nightmare. I looked to the end of the street and saw Billy was up there waiting on me. But the boy was no longer mocking or tormenting me. Instead, he remained silent, his eyes filled with sorrow. I noted how his scarf was gone and there was a thick red mark around his neck. All of a sudden, the tragic stories of the street started to make sense. I continued to watch as Billy slowly lifted his arm and pointed towards a house right at the end of the street, directing me to its front door. Despite all the horrors I'd already witnessed, I somehow knew I needed to see whatever was inside and hopefully find some answers to this mystery. And so, I cautiously walked forward, avoiding the wall of thick fog and Billy's dead eyes as I passed him and made my way to the house. The door was already open, and the number on it was 33. When I glanced up, I saw red smoke emanating from the house's chimney, and I believed this was an omen. I hesitated briefly before entering, feeling a cold chill, thinking that perhaps I didn't want to discover what was inside. But I forced myself to do so, as my whole journey had apparently been leading up to this point. I walked into yet another small, terraced house decorated like it was straight out of the 1940s, and proceeded to a tiny living room where an elderly man with white hair and a long, disheveled beard sat in front of a roaring fire, its heat warming up the small room. He read from a book, which I quickly identified as being a copy of the King James Bible, and by his side lay what appeared to be a full-size wolf, its white fur matching its owner's beard. The beast growled aggressively at me, showing its teeth. I instinctively backed off, but the man calmed his animal with soothing words.
Now, boy, that's no way to treat our guests.
The wolf returned to its slumber as the man addressed me without looking up from the good book.
Welcome, friend. Please take a seat.
Puzzled yet intrigued, I grabbed a wood-backed chair and sat facing the enigmatic old man, watching him carefully as he continued to read from his Bible. He remained silent for some time before eventually speaking, reading a passage out loud.
If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness.
He slowly nodded his head, appearing deep in thought before he closed the book and rose from his armchair. Then he carefully placed the Bible on a bookcase beside the fireplace. I glanced up and noticed other works of religion and philosophy from throughout history, including the Quran, the Vedas, and the Torah, as well as Plato's Republic and Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. There were many other works too, some I recognized, others I'd never heard of. I imagined holy texts from long extinct religions and perhaps philosophies from future civilizations still to come. I didn't know who this mysterious bearded man was. A deity? A spirit? Who could say? Regardless, I soon got the impression that he held all the answers I sought. The man saw me looking at his bookshelf and offered an explanation.
Humanity has many theories of the meaning of life and what lies beyond the mortal realm. Some are partially correct, others are very wrong. In truth, only those who have crossed over know the truth, and they're never coming back.
He smiled thinly, meeting my gaze for the first time. When I looked into his deep, dark eyes, I felt like I was drowning.
You've come far, my young friend. It's been a long time since a mortal made his way to this realm. I must congratulate you on your tenacity.
I was awestruck by the entire situation and struggled to reply, muttering, Thank you, sir. And where is this place exactly? The man snorted before answering.
You're a smart young man. I think you already know the answer. But let me elaborate. Purgatory Street, as you call our little realm, is something akin to a halfway house. The spirits living here aren't entirely good or bad. They all made a terrible mistake during their mortal lives and are now suffering the consequences of their actions, trapped in cycles of violence which repeat again and again. In time, some will achieve some degree of redemption, enough that they can move on to the next place, but sadly, others will be stuck here for all eternity.
And who are you, might I ask? I inquired nervously. The old man laughed softly before replying.
My real name is quite impossible for you to pronounce, and in any event, it's not relevant. Most folks call me the Gatekeeper. I sit here in this house of brick and mortar, which just happens to be located on the border between two worlds, and I do my best to keep the peace. But this isn't about me, young man. It's about you, and the decision you make next.
I felt a cold chill of anticipation as I realized something of great importance was coming.
You have two choices.
The Gatekeeper continued.
You can turn around and go back the way you came, returning to your own realm, or...
Or what? I prompted impatiently.
Or you can keep on walking through the wall of fog and on to the next realm.
I experienced a further surge of emotions in that moment, thinking my whole life had been leading up to this. What's over there? I asked.
I couldn't possibly describe it in words you could understand. The visions of the next world are something you must see with your own eyes. If you cross over, you will experience wonders far beyond your human comprehension. But there's a catch. If you choose to go over to the immortal realm, you can never come back. You will be leaving the mortal world forever.
I gasped in dismay, shocked by the implications of what I'd just been told. What should I do? I whimpered, no longer feeling confident with my choices.
I cannot make that decision for you, young man. You must decide quickly, as this realm will shift in time and space before the sun rises. Now, I'm afraid I must ask you to leave.
Suddenly, the atmosphere inside the living room became hostile as the fire crackled and the wolf growled at me. I felt unsafe, slowly backing out of the room as the bearded man shot me a parting glare. I soon found myself back out on the pavement, facing the fog bank which marked the boundary between Purgatory Street and the immortal realm beyond. My nerves were shot and my whole body shook in anticipation as I walked forward, ready to cross and bear witness to the wonders beyond. But at that moment, I paused, stopping dead in my tracks as my head was filled with doubt. Suddenly, I remembered my family and friends and my life back home. It wasn't perfect, but it was what I knew, while the other side was a great unknown. I had come this far, but was always confident I could return home. But if I took the next step, there'd be no way back. So what can I say? I choked, lost my nerve, and turned around. As I walked back down the cobblestones, I saw the door to number 33 was now firmly shut, but the other residents of Purgatory Street were there to see me off. Billy the Kid returned to his rebellious self, giving me the finger one last time as he laughed in open mockery, only adding to my humiliation. Neil Smith stood outside his front door, alive once again, as he shot me an angry look with his fists clenched. Sally was cleaning the windows of her magically restored pub, turning to give me a smile and wink as I passed. And Mr. Rashid was sweeping the pavement outside his corner shop, that inane and half-crazed grin on his lips as he wished me a good evening. And finally, the two neighborhood gossips, Mavis and Alice, were standing at the top of the road, carefully watching everything that occurred on their home street. I looked up nervously as Mavis met my eye, saying,
"So long, son. I doubt we'll meet again."
I thought about her parting words as I continued walking, but I suddenly jumped in terror at a foul cackling emitted from number 3. I looked across to see the pale-faced demon staring out at me, its sharp claws scraping against the thin glass window, and its black eyes burning with hatred. I feared what the beast would do to me if it got out onto the road, and so I ran the last few yards in a panic, and with that, I stumbled back through the transparent portal and returned to my own world, instantly feeling a huge regret as I found myself back in the run-down neighborhood just as sun rose on the far horizon. I turned around and saw Purgatory Street was gone,
replaced by the sadly familiar, rubbish-strewn wasteland, and my heart broke because I knew my adventure was over. And so, that's my story, and this is the first time I've ever told it. It's been many years since my visit to the street, and my life has gone downhill ever since. I've lost family members and friends, jumped from one unsatisfactory job to another, and have become unfulfilled and unhappy. I think back to that fateful night every day, wondering what might have been, and I regret my decision back then, realizing that I'd gone so far in my journey of discovery only to lose my nerve at the last moment. But it won't happen again. I return to that spot every night, hoping against hope that Purgatory Street will reappear and allow me to cross back over. I've had many years of disappointment, but one day, my persistence will pay off. I will walk the street again, and this time, I'm not coming back. Wish me luck, my friends.
On December 2nd, 1987, the Soviet Deep Space Network received a transmission from outer space. It was the first picked up by the Galanaki RT-70 radio telescope, and soon confirmed by other telescopes within the system. The signal, which was repeated every day for about 2 weeks, came from the KIC 846-2852, today more famously known as Tabby's star. It's an F-type main sequence star located in the constellation Cygnus, approximately 1,470 light-years from Earth. Unusual light fluctuations of the star, including up to a 22% dimming in brightness, were discovered by citizen scientists as part of the Planet Hunters project. These observations puzzled the scientific community, which has yet to explain what kind of natural phenomenon could cause such a massive dip in brightness in a star. My team, however, wasn't as surprised. Given the transmission and the nature of its content, we felt confident that the dimming of Tabby's star must have been a result of some kind of artificial megastructure, such as a Dyson swarm. The transmission contained 2 datasets. The first set was a mathematical blueprint of a large rectangular structure resembling a door frame, and the second one was a date, communicated to us with the help of a number of illustrations of our solar system, where the planet's orbits around the sun were used to indicate the passage of time. It only took us a week to figure out which date it was, November 18th, 2019, but we weren't able to figure out what would happen on that date. Although, as you can probably guess, by now we know. We spent decades trying to build the structure, and almost lost our funding several times, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but slowly, but surely, we kept trying, and trying, and trying. And then, around the same time Tabby's star began appearing in the media, we finally finished it. It looked sublime. A giant gateway standing at the center of our Siberian facility in the middle of nowhere. It didn't have any visible features except a hole at the top, but it consisted of billions of intricate circuits, cooled down to around -460 degrees, and it was powered by a small nuclear reactor. Even though the entire facility felt as cold as Antarctica, not just because of the dilution refrigerators, but also the harsh weather outside, I was still sweating when we were about to turn the power on for the first time, but nothing happened. No matter what we tried, we couldn't get it to do anything. For years, all we could do was monitor it. It was disappointing, especially after all the hard work we had put into it. Our last hope was the mysterious date, and after it had come to pass, everything changed. On Monday, November 19th, 2019, at 2354 KART, an object entered Earth's atmosphere above the Pacific Ocean. To the unexpecting astronomers around the globe, it looked identical to a small meteor. We knew better, though, and a Lada-class submarine was deployed with me on board, together with the rest of the crew. The object came down on Disappointment Island, an uninhabited island in the Auckland Islands archipelago. It felt surreal stepping ashore, not knowing what kind of alien artifact we would find there. It was during the hour of fading twilight when we arrived, and the birds swarming the island as if in apprehension aroused an eerie sensation crawling up my spine. We found the object inside a crater. It was spherical, about as large as a pool ball, and its surface looked like the surface of the giant structure we had built in Siberia. Unlike our construction, however, this dark sphere was active. It took some time for us to understand that, though, since its activity was only audible.
Quiet,
I said to the soldiers that had stepped ashore with me.
listen.
None of us moved a muscle while we stood around the crater. There was an echo of slow, dragging footsteps coming from the sphere. It didn't sound like a recording, more as if we heard something actually happening in front of us, if that makes sense. The footsteps stopped for a minute and then continued until they faded out completely. After that, at least as far as we could hear beneath the agitated birds on the windy island, a brave soldier volunteered to touch the sphere, making sure it was safe, and after that, we moved it to the submarine. It wasn't as heavy as it looked, just as if it was hollow. During our entire voyage back to Russia, I sat next to the sphere, listening carefully. It was mostly silent, but now and then I could hear the echo of something that reminded me of metal scraping against metal, although I couldn't explain what it was that I heard, or by which means I could hear it. It still felt ominous and foreboding. Back at the freezing facility, we soon discovered that the sphere would fit perfectly within the hole at the top of the structure, and thus that it was what had been missing all these years, the last piece of our puzzle. It has traversed through space for more than 1,000 years, my colleague and dear friend Dmitri told us, although we all already knew. Alexander, he said and looked up at me from his wheelchair. I nodded.
Amazing.
Sonia, our chief engineer, said.
Alien footsteps from 1,000 years.
I cleared my throat, interrupting her. I'm not so sure these sounds are recordings, and looked at my colleague's uncertain eyes. There have been no repetitions thus far, I continued. Every sound we've heard has been unique, and several hours have passed. What are you trying to say? Dmitri asked, anticipating an answer beyond his wildest imagination. Are you suggesting... Well, it's just a thought, a hypothesis at best, but I think we have to consider that the sound has something to do with the obvious function of this black orb. The structure is clearly meant to be a doorway, and this spherical component, as you all probably think as well, is most likely what will open the doorway, what will connect our world to their world.
You mean this thing is already connected to...
Sonia began without finishing. I bit my frozen lip nervously, collecting my thoughts. If I would have to guess, I would say it's entangled with an identical object on the other side on a quantum level, somehow allowing us to hear what is happening 1,000 light years away in real time. And although it's beyond our knowledge how, I do believe that it is through this entanglement that the sphere will allow us to go there. Perhaps in an instant if we were to place it inside the hole at the top of the structure. We all felt the pressure of fate, perhaps the fate of mankind on our shoulders. If this is true, Dmitri whispered, it means that it goes both ways.
Oh my god,
Sonia said with a trembling voice.
They can hear us.
We proceeded to set up a soundproof chamber in which we put the sphere together with microphones so that we could observe its activity without it being able to observe us. While we studied it, trying to find as many clues as possible about what to expect on the other side, we began talking about what to do next. At this point, the higher-ups in the Russian Space Forces and even the government had suddenly become extremely interested in our little underfunded team of engineers and researchers. They sent in analysts, diplomats, and generals who all wanted their say in the matter of how to proceed. I will not dwell on the politics of it all, but it quickly became a mess, and its first victim was unsurprisingly the scientific method. My team wanted to study the sphere for maybe 2 years before putting it inside the structure, not only to learn as much as possible, but also to be safe. But the generals, only caring about their careers, didn't want us to sit on this longer than a few months, and in the end, Even though we still only heard strange metallic scraping coming from the sphere, they decided on a very simplistic plan, namely to put the sphere in place, send in a probe, and then, if it looked safe, send a team through what we assumed to be a gateway. They didn't listen to our warnings about rushing things, but they did at least take the potential threat seriously enough to prepare for it in the way we asked for. Since we knew next to nothing about the beings who sent us the sphere, except that they were thousands of times more advanced than us, we had no choice but to prepare for the worst with the strongest defense known to man, a thermonuclear missile. Seeing the PC-28 catmap being rolled into the facility prior to opening the gateway was a menacing sight to behold. If something hostile were to enter from the other side, the bomb would be detonated and obliterate everything in the area. In the middle of June this year, a crane lifted the sphere up to the top of the structure. I stood next to Dimitri and the rest of my team down at the floor, alarmingly close to the armed missile. I looked at the young soldiers next to it who had been given the assignment to trigger it in the worst-case scenario. I asked myself, were they really prepared for death at their tender age? And then I thought, if so, how brave? If not, how foolish? The structure was surrounded by military guards with dogs, while the generals stood on an impromptu observation deck a few hundred meters away. The probe we intended to send in was a rover sent to us from Roscosmos. A female voice spoke through the PA system and echoed through the cold facility. There might have been a way for us to avoid noise around the sphere, but since we had been ordered to go through with the mission so quickly, we hadn't had the time. This meant that everything said on our side, especially the instructions being delivered through the speakers, could be heard on the other side. It was reckless to say the least. As suspected, the spheres fit perfectly in the hole at the top of the structure. We didn't know what to expect, but we all expected something. A silence fell upon all of us. I didn't even dare to breathe, but nothing happened. For a moment, we all thought there was something wrong. Then the dogs began barking like wild animals. It made the hair on my neck stand on end because it meant that something had happened. We just couldn't sense it. One of the dogs got free somehow and ran up to the gateway. The soldier in charge of it ran after, yelling for it to stay put, but it wouldn't listen. And then when it ran through the gateway, it vanished. A collective gasp could be heard throughout the facility, and then a concerning murmur. The gateway was, without a doubt, open. Did that dog just travel over 1,000 light years? Dimitri asked. No one said anything for a couple minutes, fruitlessly trying to hear the dog through the sphere. And then one of the generals spoke with authority from the speakers in the ceiling.
Send in the probe.
The rover vanished just like the dog. We all looked at the screens on the wall, which were connected to the rover through a cable that now seemed to hang in the air by itself in suspenseful anticipation. Nothing. There was a crash coming from the sphere, and then everything went silent again. I gulped out of anxiety. We debated what might have happened, but of course, there was no way for us to know. It was suggested that the rover might have fallen over by accident, and for no other reason than convenience, that was taken as a fact. Next, we put a camera on a metal bar and inserted it into the portal, and after having been retrieved 15 minutes later, we finally got to see our first glimpse of what it was like on the other side. The recording was heavily distorted and didn't reveal much, just as if the camera had been subjected to some kind of radiation, although none was detected, but it was clear that there was a large, open space on the other side. The ground was too flat to be natural, and there were shadows in the distance indicating structures. Nothing of what we saw offered any explanation as to what had happened to the rover, and the dog was nowhere to be seen. I had to argue for Dimitri to be on the team that was eventually decided to be sent through the gateway. Since he was in a wheelchair, the general in charge thought he would be a liability to the rest of the team, but I convinced him that his expertise in exobiology was absolutely necessary. That wasn't the entire truth. After the accident with the Soyuz TM-5 spacecraft that put Dimitri in the wheelchair, he had spent almost all his life working on our top-secret project. I would be damned if he, my best friend, wasn't allowed to see the fruits of his own labor, and thus I proudly helped him inside the spacesuit. Now you'll get to be the cosmonaut you were always meant to be, I said with a smile on my otherwise weather-beaten face.
We'll make history together, just like we used to back in the day. For the motherland, eh?
He said and laughed himself into a coughing fit.
I think I need a drink. After this,
I said.
We will have deserved it.
Aside from myself and my small team of scientists, a group of highly trained commando frogmen was assigned to assist us. Their presence didn't make me feel any safer. Whatever waited for us on the other side, if they greeted us with hostility, we wouldn't stand a chance. We were nothing more than pesky ants walking in through the front door of a house beyond our comprehension. Standing in front of the large gateway, all suited up, enhanced the sensation considerably. While saluting the generals on the observation deck, a female choir sang the national anthem. All this splendor, I whispered to Dmitri and patted his shoulder, only to cover up how infinitesimally small we are beneath the ancient secrets we're about to uncover. The commando next to me had to struggle in his spacesuit to make the sign of the cross. I nodded at him and smiled in an attempt to inspire some confidence. He didn't need to know that his gun would be useless. All I could hear in my helmet was my own rapid breathing, telling me how scared I really was, and the radio chatter.
Proceed forward.
It was the general. He cleared his throat and then continued with a softer voice.
Make Russia and the whole of mankind proud.
I took a deep breath. Dmitri grabbed the wheels of his chair and pushed his way toward the gateway. I hesitated for a second and looked at the people behind me. The fact that they would be over 1,000 light years away from me in a few minutes was almost impossible to wrap my mind around.
Alexander, it's time,
Sonia said. I helped her carry a metal crate with equipment. It made me feel somewhat safer, somehow, to walk next to her. Even though the spacesuit protected against the cold, I could still feel the extreme temperature coming from the frozen gateway. The gold helmet attached to my visor fogged from my icy breath. We all stepped right in front of the invisible threshold. That minute felt like hours. All I could see behind the gateway was the wall at the other end of the facility. There were no visual cues at all, not even the slightest vibration in the air. It made what was about to happen even harder to believe. No one said anything. The commandos made sure their guns were ready to fire. I looked at Sonia, but I couldn't see her face behind the visor. Well then, Dmitri finally said, Godspeed, comrades. That became the unofficial go, and we stepped over the threshold. The transition was seamless. A crack in the radio was the only indication that something had happened, cutting off our contact with Earth. For some reason, the radio signals couldn't penetrate the gateway. A wondrous sight greeted us. A star filtered through a partly cracked, orange-tinted dome that covered the entire sky, shone down on a dark and silent cityscape filled with skyscrapers taller than anything ever built on Earth. They were all black silhouettes against the rising sun. Outside of the dome, tons of twisted metal and enormous chunks of broken structures floated through space. Two things became immediately clear to us after seeing this: that we were standing on a space platform large enough to allow for its own gravity, indeed part of an attempted Dyson swarm, and that at some point between when the message was sent to Earth and now, their entire civilization was either abandoned or destroyed. Another enormous platform came into view, solemnly rising at the horizon like a black flower and casting a giant hexagonal shadow on top of us. It was ripped apart in the middle by unimaginable ancient forces, letting through a sunbeam that illuminated the landscape in front of us. Large steps climbed down from the gateway, and the rover we had sent through lay crashed against the ground beneath them. The gateway stood at the edge of a large, oval square that was surrounded by identical gateways, indicating that the people who built this civilization had sent out many messages to the stars and patiently waited for answers. The dog came running toward us from the middle of the square, proving that the platform was pressurized and filled with oxygen. Taking off our helmets was out of the question, though, since we didn't know what other gases or possibly even pathogens might have lingered in the atmosphere. We descended the stairs, Sonia and I helping Dmitri, and investigated the rover. It had clearly fallen down the stairs, just as we suspected, but there was also a set of small holes in its side that we couldn't explain. The dog wagged its tail when it reached us. One of the commandos bent down and patted it on its head. He looked at her tag.
Good girl,
he said and laughed.
Her name is Aliona, a true hero. I have a bad feeling about this place,
Dimitri said.
I mean, what happened here?
All these gateways, just waiting to be connected to some faraway world.
Look,
I said and pointed at one of the gateways at the other end of the square.
That one's broken, almost as if it was blown up.
Although my gut feeling, an uneasy inkling of apprehension, told me to stay away from this forsaken place and return to Earth, the scientific curiosity kept me going. The gateway was indeed in ruins, and by the looks of it, it was the result of an explosion. I looked back at our own gateway, anonymous among the rest of them. If anything was to happen to it, I thought, we would be stranded further away from home than anyone in the history of mankind.
Alexander!
I heard Dimitri's voice in my helmet. He was a few hundred meters away from me.
Look at these!
There were enormous, seemingly fossilized bones scattered across the ground. Sonia helped us collect some of the smaller pieces while the commandos patrolled the area. Hundreds of small holes covered the brittle fossils, just as if they had been covered in maggots at some point.
This looks like part of a skull,
I said and pointed to a piece as large as a boulder.
How fascinating.
I continued.
How astonishingly fascinating. Its size might explain why the gateways are so large,
Dimitri said.
They might have used their own size as a point of reference.
I have a theory. All these gateways, they must have built them to reach out to potentially civilized worlds. But this gateway, this particular gateway...
You don't think it just collapsed over time from natural causes?
I asked.
Maybe they invited something unfriendly,
she said.
Something more powerful than the beings who built all this?
Dimitri asked. I took a deep, unsteady breath.
If so, the question is, what happened to the ones who destroyed them?
Dimitri continued, sending shivers down my spine.
I think maybe we should return and...
Sonia was interrupted by the commandos, who yelled at us to get behind them. From one of the broad, desolate streets leading to the square, a figure as tall as a building appeared. It limped toward us, slowly stepping into the light. Just by seeing how slow it moved, I understood that it was the source of the footsteps I heard coming from the sphere on Disappointment Island. It had a skinny, gray body filled with bleeding holes. Its huge head resembled the fossils we had found on the ground, with 10 or more small eyes covering the entire face. No mouth or nose, just unblinking eyes. It moved its long arms in such a way that it looked like it wanted to shoo us away, but it was impossible to say if there was any aggressiveness behind it.
Mother of God,
Dimitri said.
This isn't right. Please, Alexander, take me back.
The dogs barked furiously, and the commandos prepared to fire out of pure panic. I grabbed Dimitri's wheelchair and instructed everyone to return to our gateway, but just before we were able to move, the alien being collapsed and fell forward. It kicked up a cloud of dust as it hit the ground. For a few minutes, we stood in silence and watched its seemingly dead body. My heart was racing, and I could feel my pulse in my temples. An echo of something large falling to the ground in the distance reached us. The uneasy feeling from before turned into dread mixed with the uncanny sensation of being watched. A sudden twitch spread through the dead body, and then, to our screams of terror, creatures began escaping through the holes in its skin and even through its many eye sockets. It's hard to describe the abhorrent sight that played out in front of us. These creatures resembled oversized black centipedes. One of them, the largest one, forced itself out through the mouth of the body, and it was at that repulsive movement the commandos opened fire. The spacesuits made it more or less impossible to run, and it felt like running in a nightmare where you never picked up speed no matter how hard you tried. The arthropodic beast swarmed toward us. One of the smaller ones crawled inside the suit of the commandos. I could see it enter his mouth and then start eating its way out of one of his eyes. A bigger one crushed the visor of another commando and ripped his head off with his spine still attached to it. I didn't run to save my life, not even to save the life of my friend, because I knew that only nuclear eradication awaited us on the other side. I ran to save mankind from the same fate that had bestowed the inhabitants of this place. Even larger creatures, as big as trains, appeared from their hiding spots inside the dark city. The dog ran in front of all of us and was the first to reach the gateway. Dimitri's wheelchair fell over just as I was about to drag it up the stairs. Some of the creatures ran past us, obviously more interested in getting through the gateway than killing us. I bent down and reached for Dimitri's hand. Sonia ran up to me and helped put Dimitri back into his wheelchair. More and more creatures entered the gateway, and there was no indication that the warhead had been set off.
Why haven't they detonated the nuke?
I asked. Since there was no way to open the visor and no time to take the helmet off, I crushed my visor against the ground and yelled toward the sphere as loud as I could.
Blow it up, you fucking cowards! Blow it up!
Sonia helped me drag Dimitri's wheelchair up the stairs.
Leave me here!
Dimitri begged.
Shut up!
I said.
I'm not leaving you with these abominations.
2 commandos ran past us. One got through the gateway, but moments later, his headless body was thrown back through it again. Then Sonia screamed and let go of the wheelchair. I almost dropped it. She put her hands on her helmet in a desperate attempt to take it off, but there wasn't any time. The creature ate its way in through her eye and continued to her brain, making her vomit uncontrollably until she fell down the stairs. It was a miracle that I got through the gateway together with Dimitri. The chaos that met us, I couldn't even describe it. The women in the choir were being ripped apart. The guards were shooting at each other while naively trying to hit the creatures. The soldiers operating the missile were nowhere to be seen, most likely because they left their post as soon as the first centipede appeared through the gateway. Except for 1 or 2 that were lying dead on the ground, the generals weren't anywhere to be seen either, but helicopters were taking off outside, so it wasn't difficult to figure out where they were. My glass visor kept cutting my chest behind the suit as I zigzagged through the mayhem, pulling Dimitri in front of me. I could still hear him through the radio in my helmet.
Leave me next to the missile,
he said.
What are you talking about?
I asked, although I already knew.
There's no reason for both of us to stay here,
he continued.
Alexander, save yourself. There's no way any of us get out of here if we succeed,
I said.
That's the entire point. Try,
Dimitri said.
You can walk. I can't.
I stopped next to the missile, not knowing what to say.
I'll give you some time unless they get too close to me,
Dimitri said.
Not time for a sentimental goodbye, my friend. Just run.
And I did, with tears of shame obstructing my vision. I did. I managed to get inside one of the helicopters that were just about to take off outside. A wife of one of the generals was sitting in it with her little boy, who must have been brought to the facility against protocol, just to let him watch history be made. He looked shell-shocked, but he was kept calm by the dog laying on the floor beneath his legs.
You saved her,
I said, and tried to smile while the helicopter took off.
You're a hero, young man. A true hero.
The facility shrunk beneath us as we rose to the sky, and the further away we got, the more worried I became that one of the creatures had gotten to Dimitri. But then, maybe 1.5 kilometers away, the blinding light from the nuclear explosion overwhelmed us. I don't remember much after that. The shockwave must have hit us pretty hard. I woke up in the rural locality Omyakan. They told me that they had found the wrecked helicopter in one of the valleys beside the town. The boy and the dog had survived, but the mother and the pilot hadn't. The villagers hadn't seen the mushroom cloud, but other than them, no one would have been able to see the explosion given its remote location. However, the increased radiation levels were detected over Scandinavia some time later. Naturally, the government kept quiet about the reason, and I truly thought that everything would go back to normal and that we had successfully averted the extinction of all life on Earth. But last week I learned that Aliana had died. Apparently, one of her eyes was missing.